Game of Thrones, The Wrath of the Sleeping Dragon. This video is purely for entertainment and does not infringe on copyrights or laws. The rights to the novel and image belong to the original author. We do not claim ownership. Don't like waiting and want to listen to this fanfic in full now? Subscribe to our Patreon, where you'll find the best fanfics. Chapter 351. Stop the Arrest. The Land of Long Summer. Viserys, who escaped from the ruins of Illyria, appointed his friend who had shared hardships with him as his second king's guard. Not long after, in the land of winter outside the wall, the army of dead people searched the mountains and seas to find the three-eyed crow that he hated, but returned in vain. With the help of the children of the forest, the other party hid very deeply and there was a magic barrier. Even the Night King found it difficult to find the other party's hiding place. What's more, those unintelligent whites, although their number was extremely large, and they searched all over the mountains and plains, they still couldn't find the whereabouts of the three-eyed crow. The existence of that crow only slightly attracted the attention of the Night King, and helped the human army to retreat smoothly. Otherwise, a fire alone would not be enough for the human army to retreat unscathed. Humans fled to Winterfell, and reorganized a new line of defense. At the same time, Mr. Luwin of Winterfell was also busy and all the ravens in the crow cages of Winterfell were released. The king's handwritten letters with the seal of the Baratheon family flew to all parts of the Seven Kingdoms. The news of the defeat of the coalition spread quickly throughout the Seven Kingdoms, even including the Iron Islands and Dorne. Although the blood noble of Dorne, Earl Wood, finally escaped, he lost a foot on the battlefield and became a cripple. Balon Greyjoy of the Iron Islands was shocked by the defeat and gloated at the same time. He did not think that these White Walkers and the army of the dead could swim across the sea. The Sunset Sea was their best barrier. Seeing the Baratheon family being defeated, Balon, who was determined to lead the Iron Islands to independence and restore the ancient road, began to plan again. He sent his second brother Euron Greyjoy to the distant Pentos with the sincerity of the Iron Islands. Visit the former Targaryen dynasty's second prince Viserys Targaryen, who has not yet set foot in Westeros, but his reputation has already shocked the Seven Kingdoms. He was crowned king of the Seven Kingdoms by his mother on Dragonstone, and had a claim to the Iron Throne. The other side was located on the other side of the Narrow Sea, and it was said that they had a strong army and 3 dragons. They were destined to fight with the Baratheon family in the future. The Greyjoy family could bet on both sides, micromanage the details, and finally get the desired results. The Iron Islands stood by and watched, treating the king's call as a roll of toilet paper, and even sent family members to secretly collude with the Targaryen family. The rest of the nobles in Westeros felt like being struck by lightning when they heard the news. Because if the North could not hold on and wait for the White Walkers to pass through the neck, they would be the next to suffer. The nobles who had not paid much attention to the White Walkers suddenly became anxious. In an instant, the feudal lords of the Seven Kingdoms could no longer care about continuing to drink and celebrate, and began to gather the young and strong men in their fiefdoms to intensify training, and at the same time, responded to the king's call to continue to send reinforcement to support the defense line of Winterfell. This time, the nobles of the Seven Kingdoms did not play it safe and do something lip service. Because the nobles have received a good education, they are not fools. They know that, if they don't unite all their forces, it is impossible to defeat the attacking northern enemies. If even the coalition forces of the 7 countries can't defeat the enemy, then his soldiers who hide their incompetence will be even less able to protect their fiefdoms and homes. Jon Arryn, who stayed in King's Landing to preside over the overall situation, actually kept a trace in his heart after the last queen's pregnancy. On the surface, the old prime minister seems not to be prepared to continue the investigation, but in fact he has been secretly continuing the investigation. Although the Duke of the Vale is old, his political skills are still strong. The results of the investigation are somewhat shocking. Basically, all the evidence points to the 2 children of His Majesty the King. Prince Joffrey and Princess Myrcella are probably not the king's biological children. The identity of the adulterer who committed adultery with Her Majesty the Queen is even more clear at a glance. All the children are blonde, and the Queen and her brother Jaime Lannister, a member of the King's Guard, have always had a close relationship since childhood, and are known as the Golden Boy and Jade Girl of the West. All the evidence has been investigated, and the biggest royal scandal in history can be uncovered only by the final arrest. However, the investigation and arrest of John Arryn came to an abrupt halt at this moment. Fluttering, ravens flew to King's Landing with a letter with the king's handwritten instructions, and John Arryn sat on the Iron Throne with an extremely ugly face. There were many dignitaries in the throne room, but they were like a shabby house, and could not hide any news. Ravens flew from Winterfell in the morning, and the news of the defeat of the coalition forces spread throughout King's Landing in the afternoon, as if they had wings. The country is now in turmoil, and the defeat of the coalition forces requires more concerted efforts to fight the enemies in the north and across the sea. If John Arryn captured Cersei and her brother today, the Westerlands would rebel tomorrow. Everyone knew that Lord Tywin's favorite was his son Jaime Lannister. He could give up Cersei and Tyrion, but he couldn't give up Jaime. Even though Tywin had heard that his good son had fucked his sister a long time ago, there had been such ups and downs in the Westerlands. But Lord Tywin was still like an ostrich, covering his ears by slitting the throats of these people, telling everyone that it was just a rumor, and that they were just siblings. Therefore, as the hand of the king, John Arryn had to temporarily stop the capture operation after repeated consideration, and at the same time, concealed the truth from Robert. Otherwise, he had no doubt that, if Robert knew the news, he would immediately give up tens of thousands of troops and rush back to kill the couple. The human coalition began to build fortifications in Winterfell again, and got a little respite, while the army of the dead was searching for the three-eyed crow outside the wall. However, the pace of winter would naturally not stop, because of a crow that could not be found. Year 292 of the Egan calendar. The army of the dead who crossed the wall began to march south again. The last Earl of Hearth, John Umber, was unwilling to give up his home, and fought to the death. But it was just a mantis trying to stop a chariot. In the end, they were crushed by the rolling army of the dead. The soldiers of Hearth were annihilated, including John Umber himself, who became a new white, and continued to move forward. The army of the dead really began to split up here. Some whites, led by other White Walkers, went straight to the Dreadfort, while others rushed to Cartha and Deepwood Motte. Chapter 352, The Battle of Winterfell. Although Bear Island is also located north of Winterfell, it was spared because it is an island. This also confirms the conjecture of Balon Greyjoy of the Iron Islands, that is, these dead people can't swim. Bear Island could have stayed out and watched the excitement like the Iron Islands, but Jorah Mormont, the Earl of Bear Island, responded to the call and actively participated in the war against the White Walkers. But such a person suddenly encountered trouble at this time. It turned out that Jorah Mormont had been secretly selling slaves before. This matter was originally well hidden, but it was exposed because of this war. In order to make money, to satisfy his greedy wife, Jorah sold the poachers to Taroshia slaves, and the slave trade was illegal in the north. Eddard Stark arrested Jorah for this, and wanted to sentence him to death. The old Earl of Bear Island, Jair Mormont, who had joined the Night's Watch, wanted to find the feudal lord to plead for mercy, but when he came to the door of Duke Stark and raised his hand, he couldn't knock it down. He knew that his son had committed a capital crime, and Lord Eddard was an iron-faced and selfless man. Moreover, what kind of identity should he use to plead for Jorah? He had already given up the title of Bear Island, and became the commander-in-chief of the Night's Watch. This incident caused quite a stir in Winterfell, the second line of defense built by humans, which was fully prepared for war. Everyone was watching Lord Eddard's actions with cold eyes. Jorah led the way in the Battle of the Wall, killed countless whites, and made meritorious contributions. However, as soon as he followed the army to retreat to Winterfell, he was arrested by his own lord, and was sent to the gallows to be hanged. However, this matter continued to ferment for a while, and old Mormont did not plead for his son, but Jorah Mormont did not die in the end, and miraculously escaped danger. It turned out that King Robert rescued Jorah. He helped this warrior who had led the way in the Battle of Pike Island, thinking that now was the time to use people. He just sold a few damned people before, and now he didn't do it again, so he should not be punished. Therefore, Robert asked Eddard Stark to release Jorah, but was refused by the upright Duke Stark. King Robert was furious. He personally ordered to pardon Jorah's crime, and asked Eddard Stark to release him. Then Doraemon walked out of the prison in Winterfell unscathed. The king's move immediately aroused unanimous praise from the soldiers of the Seven Kingdoms. People shouted the king's name and toasted him. The low morale of the coalition forces during this period was also alleviated by this incident and became more united. However, Eddard Stark, who became the villain in this story, did not explain anything from beginning to end. Even if someone would criticize and point fingers behind his back, the army of the dead crossed the Great Wall, and the guerrilla war between humans and the dead began. The human coalition seized the opportunity when the army of the dead began to split up, and took the initiative to attack everywhere, encircling and annihilating the enemy's small forces, and there were wins and losses. The famous general of the River Each, Randall Tarley, wielded the Valyrian steel sword Heartbreaker, and killed a White Walker, becoming the second person to kill a White Walker after King Robert. However, the bad news also came. The Dreadfort fell and all the people stationed there became fresh whites. Black Walder and the soldiers of the Free family who rushed to support were attacked by the White Walkers. Walder Free was trampled into a pulp by the huge white mammoth, and he was not even qualified to become a white. The Earl of the Dreadfort, Rose Bolton, was cunning and treacherous. He led the knights of the Dreadfort to make a big circle, and did not rush home at all, so he survived. The war between humans and the army of the dead continued on this land, fighting, ambushing, burning, etc. Humans used all their strategies to try to stop the steps of the White Walkers. However, the army of the dead did not have any tactics, but only used one trick, which was to keep moving forward and simply and rudely reach the base camp of the human coalition. The second line of defense of the human coalition, Winterfell, has long been ready. The soldiers mustered their energy, and the knights were wearing shining helmets and armor. They swore that this time they would defeat the White Walkers under Winterfell, protect the safety of the people of the Seven Kingdoms behind them, recover the lost land, and drive all the damn demons back to the outside of the Great Wall. The seven gods are generally not believed in north of the Neck, but the archbishop who stayed in the Starry Cathedral in Old Town still appointed 3 archbishops to rush to Winterfell, praying for the mercy of the seven gods, so that the holy light could descend on this heretical land. The people of the north did not stop them, but just silently prayed that the old gods could listen to their prayers. Now the people of the north are in a desperate situation. No matter which god they are, as long as they can help, the people of the north are willing to believe in it. Unfortunately, however, perhaps the seven gods are not willing to descend on this land, where the seven gods are generally not believed in. In the words of the fanatical monks, heresy is everywhere. The old gods seem to have really been forgotten by the years, and the desperate prayers of the people of the north have not received any response. August, 292nd year of the Egan calendar. Half of the new year has passed in a flash, and the tragic defeat at the wall is still vivid, but the White Walkers have once again arrived at the gates of the city. Soon the war broke out. The human coalition had experienced the last setback, and this time it broke out with greater resilience, stubbornly resisting the attack of the army of the dead. At the same time, more fire oil and fire arrows were prepared, trying to use fire to defeat these enemies who should have entered the 7 layers of hell. However, ordinary flames were not enough to defeat these terrible enemies. The Night King extinguished a piece of fire and created an ice road. Countless whites who were afraid of fire poured in from here and instantly defeated the coalition's front. After the defeat, the coalition fled into Winterfell, but the walls and gates were not enough to stop these dead people for too long. After all, the dead people used their teeth and bodies to knock open the gate. The dead lying under the wall fell one after another, stepping on the bodies of their companions and madly climbing up the wall, knocking down the human soldiers, and then jumping into Winterfell. The night was dark, the biting cold wind blew up the billowing smoke, and the flames burning in Winterfell illuminated the entire dark sky. The North Gate and the Godswood fell one after another. Then came the Broken Tower, the first castle and the armory. Kill. The allied soldiers and the army of the dead launched a fierce street battle in Winterfell, fighting to the death. As the family of this castle, Lady Stark Catelyn held her youngest son Brandon, and pulled her youngest daughter Arya. At the same time, she took the other 3 children, Robb, Jon and Sansa, and hurriedly boarded the carriage to escape to the south. King's Landing. Catelyn, take our children to King's Landing. The further south the better. Eddard Stark, the Duke of Winterfell, was bathed in blood, holding the Valyrian sword ice, holding his wife's head tightly on his forehead, and panting loudly. The elegant and tough woman couldn't help but burst into tears at this moment. No matter what happens, don't come back. Keep fleeing south. Keep fleeing south. If King's Landing falls, flee to Storm's End. If Storm's End falls, take a ship and flee to Pentus. Chapter 353. The third line of defense of the Allied forces. Her husband's voice still echoed in Catelyn's ears. He told her not to look back, no matter what happened. Even if he died here. Eddard Stark asked his wife to take the children and flee south. Escape to the continent of Essos. Escape to the end of the world. But he was not going to leave. As a man, a lord, and a husband, he wanted to fight these White Walkers to the death and defend his home. Kill. Now Winterfell has become a chaotic battlefield with shouts and screams everywhere, and people are killing. When he said this, Eddard Stark suddenly hesitated, as if he wanted to say something, but finally gritted his teeth. Catelyn and Eddard leaned over his wife's ear and whispered a few more words. What? Then, in Catelyn's unbelievable eyes, Eddard gently kissed his wife's forehead. Follow me. Then the dark brown-haired man raised the big sword in his hand, turned around and returned to the battlefield without hesitation. Boom. Soon after, there was another loud noise, and the hunter gate fell. Roar. The army of the dead also poured in from the other side of Winterfell. The kennels and the library were gradually occupied by the Whites. The soldiers of the coalition fought hard and gradually retreated to the main castle in the center of Winterfell, which was easy to defend and difficult to attack. The carriage carrying Lady Catelyn and several young Starks left the south gate of Winterfell in a hurry. The carriage was protected by guards loyal to the Stark family and ran all the way along the King's Road to King's Landing. The fierce battle of the night passed in a flash. The sky gradually turned pale. With the fall of the main castle of Winterfell, the coalition was defeated again in the war. Some soldiers fled to the cellar of Winterfell in a panic, guarding the tomb of the Stark family, hoping that the Stark ancestors could show up and save them. More defeated troops fled from the south gate of Winterfell and fled along the King's Road to Severn City, which was the rear of the coalition forces and had a large amount of supplies. The nobles of the Seven Kingdoms who responded to the king's call to participate in the fight against the White Walkers learned their lesson this time. Seeing that the situation was not right, they turned around and fled. They led their troops to flee on the King's Road in a disorderly manner. Now they are all running away. The Guardian of the North, Eddard Stark, had already been determined to die with Winterfell, but at the last moment, he was ordered by His Majesty to be tied to a war horse and forcibly taken away. The nobles of the Seven Kingdoms ran ahead, and King Robert became the one who fought to the end. The army retreated and abandoned the castles along the way. Even Winterfell could not be stationed, let alone the castles along the way. The human coalition assembled the excellent commanders of the Seven Kingdoms. In fact, after brainstorming, many commanders learned the lessons of the last defeat, made up for many shortcomings, and made full preparations for the loss of Winterfell. Many commanders of the coalition decided to place the third line of defense of the human army in a natural moat comparable to the Wall of Despair, the Neck. However, compared with attacking from the south, it became much easier to capture the Bay of Kaelin from the north. However, even so, the coalition still hoped to stop the army of the dead through the chaotic waterways of the Neck and the swamps that could not be extricated once they were deeply trapped. They could unite with the Reed family of Grey Water Watch. These swamp demons who have lived in the Neck for many years are very familiar with the chaotic waterways and paths of the Neck. They may help the coalition stop the footsteps of the army of the dead. Now the commanders of the coalition have also seen that it is difficult to defeat the Night King by relying on the power of the Seven Kingdoms alone. They must rely on some great power of nature. The Neck is the best line of defense. Before the Battle of Winterfell, a red-robed witch from Ashay appeared in the tent of the coalition. She did not hide her identity and told Robert directly that she was a believer of the god of fire and shadow and she served the true king. She came to help the coalition defeat the White Walkers, the common enemy of all mankind. Melisandre revealed her identity, which immediately caused an uproar in the coalition hall. This was the first time that the Targaryen family sent an envoy to stand in front of Robert Baratheon. since Robert seized the Iron Throne after the War of the Usurper. Once, although the Iron Throne knew that there was an exiled second prince of the Targaryen family on the other side of the Narrow Sea, and even crowned him as king. And Viserys followed his mother from King's Landing to Dragonstone, and later fled from Dragonstone to the continent of Essos after his mother died. He naturally knew who had taken their family's world. However, the Targaryen family and the Baratheon family have never had any contact with each other, except for sending assassins to show respect to each other. There is no other contact. The Iron Throne pretended not to see the enemy on the other side of the Narrow Sea, and even some of the vassals under it secretly hooked up with the Targaryen family, but they could only be helpless and furious, and could not find any evidence. Therefore, Melisandre's statement of her identity naturally caused an uproar. However, Robert was the current king of the Seven Kingdoms after all, and he did not make things difficult for a woman on the surface. Perhaps he also wanted to show his grace in front of the ministers. It was a rule everywhere that the two armies would not kill the envoys in front of each other. He could allow Melisandre to stay in the barracks as a Targaryen envoy, but he asked her to prove that she had the ability to help the coalition win. The barracks would not keep a useless woman. Then Melisandre lit a ball of fire in the air, which shocked everyone. Her strength was far better than that of an ordinary male soldier, so she naturally obtained the qualification to stay in the barracks. However, Melisandre was in a state of semi-house arrest, so she was naturally not allowed to pass on information to the outside world or walk around. Then Melisandre proposed her own plan to fight against the Night King. To defeat the Night King, we need to rely on the right time, right place, and right people. None of these three conditions can be missing. This was a sentence that Viserys had said inadvertently. Melisandre felt that this sentence seemed to be in line with the truth. She was surprised and secretly wrote it down and now used it here. There are only two true gods in the world. The true Lord R'hllor represents light, heat, and life, while his mortal enemy is the god of cold, who represents darkness, cold and death. For countless years, the winter solstice and summer are actually endless battles between the Lord of Light and the God of Cold. The wind was cold outside the castle. Although there was a blazing fire in the fireplace, the nobles of the Seven Kingdoms in the hall were all wrapped in thick fur. Melisandre was only wearing a thin red robe and standing in the center of the hall, talking confidently. Coupled with the means she just showed, it was natural that people could not ignore her. She ignored the ugly faces of the three archbishops representing the seven gods in the hall. These believers of false gods had no power at all. She also turned a blind eye to the angry eyes of the northerners who believed in the old gods. Her words directly denied the seven gods and the old gods. How could this not make them angry? However, the red-robed witch slightly raised her delicate chin. Her expression was neither arrogant nor indifferent, but just as if she was stating a fact. She stood alone in the hall of Winterfell with the name of the Targaryen family on her head, and she actually made the nobles of the Seven Kingdoms speechless. Chapter 354, Human Migration. The arrival of midsummer means that the Lord of Light has the upper hand, and the arrival of winter means that the God of Cold has gained the upper hand. At the same time, the coalition forces must also seek help from our Lord. One is ice and the other is fire. The flame of the dragon is the weapon that can directly confront the Night King. This is called harmony among people. Melisandre believes that they can retreat to warm areas, evacuate the local people, and fortify the walls and clear the fields. Instead of wasting time in these meaningless places, it will increase casualties and dampen morale. Winterfell is not a strong city and cannot be defended at all. The coalition forces can use the power of the gods to suppress the existence of the God of Cold. In simple terms, it is to use heat to fight against cold. Let the Night King come to the warm south, where he will be suppressed and unable to exert his full strength, and then accumulate all his strength to seize the opportunity to defeat the opponent in one fell swoop. At the same time, the coalition forces must also seek help from Viserys and unite more people. This is the right time, right place, and right people. Only in this way can we lead humans to defeat the Night King. However, although Melisandre's plan seems to make sense, it is actually not recognized by the nobles of the Seven Kingdoms, and is impossible to achieve. They were unwilling to give up their ancestral homeland and retreat to the south, to fight the White Walkers to the death. It was simply nonsense to ask the Stark family to give up Winterfell. And God knows whether the Night King will really consume a lot of energy in the fight against the cold and heat after coming to the south, and will be suppressed and become weaker. Just looking at the current situation, the footsteps of the Night King represent cold and death. Wherever the army of the dead goes, there is a blizzard and the temperature drops sharply. And asking for help from the second prince, many nobles looked at each other and secretly looked at the main seat in the center. However, just looking at King Robert's ugly face, it is clear that there is no hope. But this time the fat king looked ugly, but he didn't say a word. Melisandre's plan was naturally rejected. Then the Battle of Winterfell broke out. After the defeat of the coalition forces, they fled in all directions. The large army fled to the Moat Cailin, evacuating the people who had not evacuated in time along the way. The White Walkers came from the north. The Northerners were organized to migrate to the south with their families after the defeat at the Wall. However, there are some people who are unwilling to leave their homes, believing that the White Walkers are just lies, and they stubbornly want to stick to their homes. These people finally get what they want, and become one of the army of dead ghosts. Queue up. Queue up. Don't crowd. You. What are you doing? Now the Bay of Cailin is already overcrowded before the defeated army arrives. The White Causeway in the past is crowded with northern people who have no time to evacuate. The soldiers stationed here by the coalition forces maintain order and ensure that the elderly, children and women can pass through the causeway and reach the riverland as soon as possible through the neck. The soldiers are nervous to maintain order, but there are some people who break the rules. They rely on their strong bodies and want to force their way through, but they are eventually pulled out by the soldiers of the coalition forces. Stop. Catch him. There are even people who want to take the opportunity to attack the defense line and rush through the causeway. However, after a fight, the corpses are everywhere, and the bodies of these people are thrown into the mud and fed to the lizard lions. The White Walkers went south. The coalition forces were defeated, and everyone was in a panic. Even the king ran away. Today, the north is like a pond that has been drained of water. All the fish are exposed and jumping on the muddy mudflats. All the big and small fish hidden under the water in the north have been exposed. The Brotherhood, bandits, and even the wildlings who fled into the north when the Great Wall collapsed have gradually emerged. No one wants to die, including these bandits and wildlings, but they know that they will die once they show their faces. The Great Migration of the Cailin Bay encountered several sabotage attacks by these bandits and wildlings. However, although the soldiers of the coalition army suffered a series of setbacks in the face of the White Walkers, they were still regular troops after all, and tried to control the chaotic situation. This is Lady Stark's carriage. A dusty carriage with the Stark family's dire wolf emblem came to Cailin Bay, and the soldiers stationed there hurriedly let it pass. Madam. However, the curtain of the carriage was not even opened, and the Stark family's carriage hurriedly stepped onto the causeway and left. The Red Witch who had disappeared after the Battle of Winterfell appeared in the crowd passing through the Moat Cailin. She was still wearing a thin red robe, and her every move was charming, but there was no frivolity on the woman's face. Melisandre was alone on a red horse. No one knew how she escaped from the chaotic battlefield of Winterfell, and no one knew how she ran faster than the army's retreat, and arrived at the Moat Cailin first. Who are you? The coalition soldier stationed at the Moat Cailin frowned slightly when he looked at Melisandre. He instinctively felt that this woman was a little different. However, he soon discovered that the other party came from the north in such a cold winter with only a single layer of clothes, which further confirmed this point. I'm a servant of God, the Red Witch said in a calm voice, but the soldier frowned even more. He felt that this person was a little weird, but there were too many people queuing behind him, and he didn't have time to identify too much. Besides, she is just a woman. Even if a woman has problems, how much trouble can she cause? The soldier wiped this thought from his mind and waved his hand. Okay, you go through. The elderly, women, and children were given priority to pass through the Bay of Cailin. Melisandre's identity was naturally not too much of a barrier. Then the woman nodded slightly and rode into the long causeway on a chestnut warhorse. Father, a daughter cried out to her father, who was locked outside the causeway. Be careful. People helped up the old man who fell down. This way. This way. The causeway was noisy and chaotic, with chaotic voices everywhere. This was the largest population migration in the history of Westeros, and it was also an unprecedented mass exodus. All the people in the north fled to the south with their families under coercion and call. If the coalition wants to defeat the Night King, the most important thing is to do a good job of clearing the fields. Otherwise, when the White Walkers swept across the entire north, it would probably be the real beginning of the disaster. No one can resist the advance of the army of millions of dead, and the destruction of the world is probably imminent. The long causeway is waist deep in mud on both sides, emitting a foul smell. There are also huge flowers, lizard lions and many snakes. The dense bushes have been immersed in the swamp for many years, and fungi like curtains hang down between the branches. The neck swamp is full of dangers. The causeway is the only safe way. If you leave the causeway, there are things everywhere that can easily take your life. The marching team is long. Most of them are carrying luggage, dragging their families, supporting each other, and there is no end in sight. In the chaotic crowd, Melisandre rode on horseback, followed the team slowly, quietly looking at the surrounding scenery and the various aspects of the world, and then couldn't help but sing. We mortals, living and dying alone, at a loss, wandering in the valley. Fortunately, we have compatriots, gathering together, and fortunately, God, who praises us. The woman's voice was cold and melodious, and soon resonated with the old and young present. Although they did not understand what the woman was singing, they still sang along. The night was long, and the journey across the neck was still a long way off, and Melisandre's influence among these old people, women, and children gradually expanded. Pentos, far away from here. It has been several months since His Majesty the King left his throne, and intelligence about the battle between the coalition forces and the White Walkers in Westeros has been coming in like snowflakes. A Baron, acting as the Prime Minister, handles a lot of official business every day, while responding to various requests for help from the Seven Kingdoms. However, Viserys has not returned for a long time, and the Targaryen army dared not move for a day. The young king is the flag of the country and the most important and core part of the entire machine. And now, in the early morning, a huge figure covering the sky and the sun appeared on the horizon of Pentos. Chapter 355 Return. I didn't expect that the nobles of Westeros would be beaten to a pulp by the White Walkers before we could even attack them. In the nine-towered palace of Pentos, Princess Rhaenys was wearing a gorgeous silver dress, with her long brown hair hanging down to her slender waist. The girl sat on the throne in the center of the hall, listening to the intelligence from across the narrow sea. Rhaenys' pretty face was full of seriousness, and she looked a bit like a queen. She had a silver dragon head medal on her chest, symbolizing her identity as a member of the Targaryen family. Princess Rhaenys' uncle Oberyn was wearing a black and gold rimmed dress, with the medal of the king's hand on his chest. He stood with his hands down in the position of the princess, looking calmly at the noisy crowd below. The person who spoke was Miss Toyne, the commander of the 4th Legion of the Kingdom, who was once the commander of the Golden Group, and is now one of the Legion leaders. Since the soldiers of the Golden Group received the pardon edict written by Viserys, they have been looking forward to the day of attacking Westeros day and night. They want to return to the homeland, where their ancestors have lived for generations, and regain the glory of their ancestors. Now the information about the battle between the Seven Kingdoms and the White Walkers on the continent of Westeros is flying like snowflakes. This matter is undoubtedly the most concerned news at the moment, including the free trade city-state. As the city on the continent of Essos closest to King's Landing, Pentos is naturally very well informed. The coalition was defeated. The defeat of the two wars caused the northern region of the entire country to fall rapidly and become a real purgatory on earth. No one can survive where the White Walkers pass, and the rolling tide of corpses has not stopped and is still moving towards the warm south. An unprecedented human migration is also taking place. People staying in Pentos really can't imagine what kind of existence the White Walkers, the Whites, and the army of the dead are. Why do the dead get up? However, they only knew that the Baratheon dynasty was defeated, the entire north had been completely lost, and the Iron Throne fell into an unprecedented weakness. Now is the best opportunity for Targaryen to send troops to Westeros and regain the Iron Throne. The soldiers are eager to fight for honors and achievements, strive to get the title of knight, and step from civilians to the aristocracy. Viserys' new policy encourages civilians to be knighted by military merit, so Targaryen's army has an unprecedented desire for war, and everyone wants to change their fate. But unfortunately, His Majesty the King lost contact at this time, and disappeared with his dragon for several months. In the few months that Viserys was away, Pentos was calm. 5,000 unsullied city guards, Dothraki, the 1st Legion, the 2nd Legion, and the 4th Legion. Targaryen's forces are now complicated and intertwined, and it is impossible to cause any abnormal movement. If there is a problem in any link, it is very likely that other links will work together to eliminate it. They all obeyed the orders of Her Royal Highness the Princess, and Rhaenys, referring to the advice of her uncle Oberyn, had been actively preparing for war, stockpiling supplies and training soldiers, waiting for her brother to return. It seems that these noble lords have no ability. Haha, that's right. Someone in the hall whispered and echoed the words of Miss Toyne. The atmosphere seemed very relaxed. They felt that the enemy on the other side of the narrow sea was vulnerable. The important officials of the kingdom standing in the forefront, such as Prime Minister Oberyn, Minister of Finance Illyrio, and Minister of Justice Jon Connington, were silent. They knew that the Baratheon dynasty was not weak. The alliance of wolves, deer, and ospreys formed the basic foundation of this country, and overturned the Targaryen dynasty in its twilight years. The Lannister family produced a queen, and now the Highgarden Rose has also married the Baratheon family, and become part of the alliance. Even King Robert has betrothed Princess Myrcella to Dawn Prince Quentyn Martell. The whole country is as solid as a rock, and it is an unprecedented heyday. However, even such a dynasty that had restored the gloom of the War of the Usurper, which was at its peak, was beaten to a bloody pulp when facing the White Walkers. This is enough to show the terribleness of this enemy belonging to all mankind. Don't underestimate our enemies, my lords. At this time, the girl sitting on the throne took a deep breath and spoke. As soon as she spoke, the whole audience fell silent. Whether it is the White Walkers or the Usurpers, they are not enemies that can be underestimated. The Usurper once defeated my father, and the White Walkers created the Long Night 8,000 years ago. Rhaenys' voice echoed in the hall. Jon Connington, who was standing in the front row below, looked up at the girl sitting on the throne, and talking eloquently without any stage fright, nodded slightly, and secretly recognized in his heart. The princess is worthy of being the daughter of His Highness Rhaegar, and she really has the style of her father. At this moment, a low and melodious dragon roar suddenly came from the horizon, and it spread across the sky above the entire Pentos with the morning sun. The people, vendors, patrolling unsullied soldiers, slaves, etc. on the road all raised their heads, and there was a slight commotion, looking up at the sky. And Rhaenys, who was sitting on the throne as regent, was also slightly stunned, and the ministers in the throne room suddenly looked at each other. If the dragons did not receive the orders of the two princesses, they would not easily appear in Pentos to disturb the lives of civilians, and the dragons were not suitable for city life, so they had to be allowed to hunt on their own. Viserion and Rhaegal had not appeared in the eyes of the people of Pentos for a long time. Without the discipline of their elder brother, the two dragons became much wilder. If it's not Rhaegal and Viserion, then this is. Rhaenys and her uncle Oberyn looked at each other. Wow. Then the girl hurriedly stood up from the throne with her skirt lifted, and at this time, a guard outside hurriedly ran over to report. Your Highness. Your Majesty. Your Majesty. Balerion landed on the square outside the palace, because the parade ground inside the palace was not big enough to accommodate this huge beast. However, it was unexpected that the black dragons landing outside the palace attracted a huge crowd of people. Countless Pentos people crowded around to watch and greeted Viserys loudly. During the time when Viserys was away from Pentos, the people were also very worried about this young king. They were worried that, if Viserys had any accident, his good days would be over. After all, no great noble would treat the lower class people as well as he did, and the people also sincerely supported Viserys. Chapter 356 Situation. Viserys was wearing shiny Valyrian steel armor, with long curly silver gold hair hanging on the armor. With a clean and handsome face, a high nose bridge, violet eyes, and a warm smile on his face, he was simply a killer for girls. Viserys jumped off the dragon's back and waved to the onlookers. Pentos is so prosperous. Maya followed closely behind him. It was her first time to come to Pentus. Just looking down from the sky, she was also shocked by the prosperity and strength of the city. The towering white walls, the huge red temple, the staggered square brick towers, the huge port, including the 9-towered palace on the top of the mountain overlooking the sea, and the soft beach below. Pentus is even more prosperous than her hometown Volantis. In fact, although Pentus' military strength has always been insufficient, its economic development is still excellent. Now that the Targaryen family has taken over Pentus, it has made up for the shortcomings of this city, and Viserys has brought a powerful army. With money and an army, Pentus's comprehensive strength came from behind, counter-attacking Volantis and firmly occupying the second position of the trading city-state. There is even a chance to challenge Braavos' leading position. Volantis and Braavos used to be two poles of dispute, competing for the dominant voice of the trading city-state. Volantis has a powerful army that sweeps across the trading city-states, while Braavos has an invincible fleet that controls the sea. However, now that Volantis has gradually declined, and Pentus has come from behind, it has become a land and sea competition between Pentus and Braavos. The female knight also wore a bright lady's armor, a snow-white cloak on her shoulders, a plain white shield in her hand, and a plain longsword hanging from her waist. Her temperament looked heroic. "I didn't expect you to be so popular in Pentus." The two hurriedly ran straight to the palace, and Maya looked around with some curiosity. Seeing the people of Pentus' support for Viserys, she couldn't help but whispered behind Viserys. The two of them were naturally a king and his subject in public, but in private they were friends and could chat normally. Viserys didn't mind her calling him by his name. Having the support of the people is the foundation of a king. Viserys just smiled slightly and then stopped smiling. He thought it was normal. He walked in front and spoke calmly. "If a king doesn't have the support of the people, then there is a big problem." "You have a point." The female knight thought for a moment and nodded. "Your Majesty, Your Majesty." Then the soldiers outside the palace saw Viserys, and behind him followed a female knight in a white robe that they didn't know. But they didn't dare to ask more questions, and hurriedly saluted slightly. Boom boom. Then they pushed open the door of the palace. The people in the throne room of the palace, led by Her Royal Highness the Princess, naturally came out to greet them. Seeing Viserys, Rhaenys lifted her skirt and ran over to give him a big hug. "Viserys, you are finally back." Rhaenys hugged Viserys gently, feeling the cold Valyrian steel armor on his body, and Viserys also rubbed her hair. This time Rhaenys did not cry. Perhaps because she had gotten used to Viserys' departure, or perhaps because the girl had grown up and knew how to hold up a princess's demeanor. Maya stood behind Viserys, holding the hilt of the sword in one hand and the white plain shield in the other. The female knight took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders and back slightly, and raised her full chest, because she noticed that many people were watching Viserys hugging the girl, and they were also secretly looking at her. This girl should be Rhaenys. Maya thought to herself that Viserys had introduced her before coming. He had a niece, Rhaenys, who stayed behind to supervise the country, and the two had the best relationship. He also had a younger sister, Daenerys, but the younger sister was still young. Then Viserys let go of Rhaenys, and then looked around, surrounded by old faces. "Your Majesty, Your Majesty." This time, Viserys did not tell them where his destination was, and even Rhaenys did not know that he had gone to explore the ruins of Valyria. Therefore, now all these people looked at Viserys with curious eyes. They were also somewhat curious about where Viserys had gone and why there had been no news for several months. After Viserys left, they also intended to search for news about His Majesty the King, but found nothing. If a person could still hide, it would not be so easy to hide a dragon as big as Balerion. However, Viserys did not explain anything, but just nodded slightly, and then introduced the identity of the female knight to everyone. "She is the new King's Guard I appointed during this trip, Sir Maya." Sir Maya. Viserys actually brought back a female King's Guard after going out, which surprised everyone present, and they could not help but look at each other. If they remembered correctly, this should be the first female member of the King's Guard in history. However, Viserys has always been strong in the new dynasty, so although the ministers present were a little strange in their hearts, especially Jon Connington, who was a little hesitant to speak several times, they finally said nothing. Then Viserys briefly introduced the people present, and the female knight also took the initiative to greet the people present. Then the group returned to the hall. Viserys naturally sat back in his seat, and the servant brought a chair from the side for Enos to sit on the side seat next to Viserys. The White Knight stood behind her king with one hand on the hilt of the sword. As a battle-hardened mercenary, my swordsmanship is still very good, and all of them are based on practical killing skills. She can kill the monsters in the ruins of Illyria one-on-one. Although she is just a girl, everyone present may not be her opponent except a baron. Jon may only be at the same level as Maya, but Jon's talent is not in fighting. Viserys sat on the throne and listened to Rhaenys' report on the recent events in Pentos and the intelligence just received from across the Narrow Sea. Has the entire north been completely occupied? Viserys' face suddenly became serious when he heard Rhaenys' words. The rapid development of the war in Westeros did surprise him. He originally thought that the Baratheon dynasty in its heyday, unlike the weakened predicament after the War of the Five Kings, should be able to fight against the White Walkers. But he didn't expect that they would be defeated in succession and have retreated to the third line of defense, the neck. If the neck is lost, it will be completely troublesome. In that case, the White Walkers will no longer have any obstacles, and the vast and flat chest and abdomen of the girl will allow the White Walkers to gallop. Then shall we send troops now, Your Majesty? Miss Toyne was refreshed and asked hurriedly. Chapter 357, The Aftermath. Viserys brought back 5 dragon eggs from outside, and not many people knew about this. However, with the frequent exchanges between the free trade cities, the news was like wings, just a little slower than the dragon, but it was still transmitted to Pentos soon after. Someone saw the figure of the black dragon appearing in the sky above the sea of smoke, but there was only the black dragon itself, not the figure of the young dragon master. The black dragon even attacked a small boat. Later, someone saw a huge monster living near the Sea of Sighs, but they did not dare to get too close, and did not see clearly whether there was anyone next to the dragon. After all, Valyrian is too big, and it is impossible to hide completely. The dragons in this world have been extinct for hundreds of years, and only 3 are known. If this black dragon is not wild, then it is probably the young dragon master. When did Viserys Targaryen quietly appear near Volantis and the Land of Long Summer? Combined with the recent abnormalities in the Sea of Smoke, the raging grey fog spread outward, swallowing the ocean and the land. It was not until then that people realized that the king had been exploring the ruins of Illyria during his disappearance. And Viserys left the demon land quietly and alive, which can be called the most low-key explorer in history. Others who came out of the ruins of Illyria alive wanted to let the whole world know that they had successfully explored the ruins, published books and biographies, and sold the various treasures and cultural relics obtained from them at high prices. In fact, this news had already exploded in Volantis before it spread to Pentos. Not long ago, the exploration plan that the Tiger Party had invested heavily in has not been heard from so far, and it has almost been wiped out. No one has come out alive. In contrast, the king of Pentos, who is extremely far away from the Volantis, explored the ruins of Illyria alone and succeeded. In fact, few people know that Viserys was following that large army at the time, but he kept his real name and made a simple disguise. Later, after further investigation, scholars who studied history in Volantis took advantage of this popularity to disclose the identity of the Targaryen family and unveiled their mysterious veil. Scholars said that among the 40 ancient families handed down from the ancient Valyria period, the Targaryen family is the only one that has remained intact to this day. Although there are survivors in other families, most of them have lost their heritage, and their blood has been tainted and is not pure. Only the Targaryen family still maintains the sacred tradition of the ancient nobility. People who have seen Viserys in person say that the characteristics of the Valyrian nobility are very obvious in him, especially after adulthood, even to the point of being eye-catching and having a beauty far beyond ordinary people, which is enough to show the nobleness and purity of his blood. Volantis experts and scholars from the Elephant Party ridiculed the Tiger Party's failed actions, mocking them for not knowing their own strength and not learning from the big losses they suffered hundreds of years ago. Then he said that the Targaryen family had a complete heritage, and their hidden scrolls might contain the answer to the secret of the Doomsday Scourge, or even the safe passage to and from the ruins. These remarks successfully pushed Viserys to the forefront. More people who didn't know much about the history of Illyria only then knew that the Targaryen family had such a great origin. They were the only ancient family that survived and maintained a complete heritage without interruption. It seems that it is understandable that His Majesty the King could ride a black dragon into the ruins of Illyria alone and walk out smoothly. People talked about it and were very interested in the so-called secrets and safe passages held by the Targaryen family, and some even had evil thoughts. But these people thought of the 3 dragons and tens of thousands of fully armed troops owned by the Targaryen family, and they suddenly became much more sober, as if they had been splashed with cold water. Obviously, not everyone in this world can make them malicious, and fists are the most powerful truth. However, even though they could not obtain the safe passage controlled by the Targaryen family, people were still very interested in what kind of treasures Viserys had obtained in the Valyrian ruins, and they talked about it. They made exaggerated speculations, and said sourly that the ruins were full of treasures, and whoever picked them up would own them. And in their hearts, they secretly imagined that, if they picked up a Valyrian steel sword, or walked out with a dragon egg, they would become a great noble, have loyal soldiers under their command, and successfully hatch a dragon and gallop in the sky. Viserys' success inspired a group of people to explore the Valyrian ruins. However, Viserys still didn't know that his affairs had caused an uproar in Volantis. Naturally, he had no time to care about these people who wanted to die in the Valyrian ruins one after another because of their desire for money. At this moment, he was in the royal forest outside the city of Andalus. A few days ago, he flew back to this place where his dream began with 2 girls. Rhaenys and Daenerys each rode their own dragons, and their dragons were equipped with unique dragon riding equipment made by Master Tob for Viserys. This set of dragon riding equipment can ensure that the dragon rider sits firmly on the dragon's back so as not to fall from the sky when the dragon is flipping and fighting in the sky. At the same time, it also takes into account some comfort, using the best fur and soft bags. After all, the most painful thing about riding a dragon is that the dragon scales are a bit painful to the buttocks. With this set of equipment, Viserys can also let Rhaenys and Daenerys ride their dragons with confidence. Although Viserion and Rhaegal are not as smart as Valyrian, they can be naughty for dragons, but they will never hurt their companions. Then Viserys rode the black dragon Valyrian, Rhaenys rode the green dragon Rhaegal, and Daenerys rode the white dragon Viserion. All the members of the Targaryen family rode their dragons, and flew away from Pentos, and returned to Andalus. Aegon watched the 3 dragons fly into the sky, and finally turned into a small black dot, and disappeared from everyone's sight. He felt mixed emotions. He was once received by his uncle in a grand ceremony, and even gongs and drums were beaten for fear that others would not know. However, all this disappeared after the last rumor storm. His presence in the family has become increasingly low. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story, and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 358, Hatching Dragons. In the distant Andalus, outside the city, in the royal forest, this place was once designated by Viserys as a forbidden zone. All hunters from nearby villages and caravans were not allowed to enter this vast forest. If anyone asked the people in the surrounding villages and towns, they would know the reason why His Majesty the King issued this ban. Everyone could tell it. Because this is where the Targaryen family raises dragons. This is not a secret at all. People living nearby can often hear deafening dragon roars from the depths of the dense forest in the middle of the night, and often see the figure of a dragon hovering in the sky of this vast forest during the day. This can even be regarded as a unique local scenery. The existence of the Targaryen dragon breeding ground attracted spies of all sizes from all over the world to flock to explore the secrets. However, most of their results were not very good. Either they were caught in prison by the patrol, or they never came out after entering, becoming a small dessert for the dragon. However, recently, the enthusiasm of these spies for the royal forest has dissipated a little, because all the dragons living here have left and followed their masters to Pentus. Now Viserys, with 2 girls, has returned to the royal forest on 3 dragons. At this moment, they are in the core of the deepest part of this endless forest. Here is a vast and flat land with an area of 1 square kilometer, which can allow 3 dragons to stretch their bodies. And there are rare traces of human construction. There are dragon caves, flat ground, and a quiet small lake. Long after the 3 dragons left, the power here is still there, and no animals dare to approach, perhaps because the breath of the dragon remains here. At this moment, Balerion and Viserion are lying down, to rest not far away, while the lively Regal flew away to hunt. And Viserys and the other 2 are lighting a bonfire next to a pot, and 5 dragon eggs of different colors and the same size are neatly stacked beside him. Brother, do you want to hatch dragon eggs? The silver-haired girl's beautiful face was illuminated by the firelight, and her lavender eyes sparkled. She looked at the 5 neatly arranged dragon eggs, and took the initiative to speak. Why don't you let me do it? Ever since Daenerys hatched 3 dragon eggs in her sleep last time, she has always wanted to try again, but unfortunately there are no dragon eggs for her to experiment with. When Viserys heard his sister's words, his eyebrows slightly raised. No need. His true dragon blood is now purer than Daenerys's, so hatching dragon eggs is naturally easy. Your hair and eyebrows have finally grown out, and you don't want them anymore? Then Viserys couldn't help but tease her. At that time, little Dana's hair and eyebrows were burned off, leaving only a bald little head. When Viserys saw her, she was still wearing a hat and veil, and didn't want to see anyone. When talking about the past, Rhaenys couldn't help but burst out laughing, and then was glared at by Daenerys. TSK. The girl pursed her lips in grievance. On the other side, after Rhaenys couldn't help laughing, her smile slowly faded, and she finally sighed slightly. Daenerys can hatch dragons, Viserys can do it, but she can't. In fact, sometimes she has the same idea as Aegon, that is, she feels a sudden sense of strangeness. Although they are all from the same family and have the same surname, Viserys and Daenerys both have very distinct family characteristics: silver hair, violet eyes, but she has long brown hair and dark eyes, and inherited her mother's family characteristics. Rhaenys sometimes secretly blames herself for not looking like a Targaryen, but when she thinks of the tragedy that happened in King's Landing, when she was still ignorant, she can't blame anything. Fortunately, Viserys' mind is still delicate, and he can always detect the moment when the girl is self-pitying, and then quietly lend a hand to pull her out of the whirlpool of thoughts. Instead of using words, he used actual results and the trust he showed to tell her that we are a family. Then Viserys placed all 5 dragon eggs in the blazing flames, and 5 prisoners who had been prepared for death were thrown in, screaming miserably. Turn your head, Viserys said calmly, but Rhaenys shook her head. It's okay. I have burned so many people to death with my own hands. Rhaenys once rode a dragon to burn the Dothraki people herself, and witnessed the real big scene. The girl grew up very quickly, from her pale face and vomiting to her face that was only slightly ugly now, but she could still take it calmly. Daenerys had been reluctant and had closed her eyes, but after hearing Rhaenys' words, she clenched her fists again and encouraged herself secretly in her heart. Then she opened her eyes and forced herself to watch the prisoners being burned to death in the sea of fire. Although Daenerys looks weak, she is actually very strong in her heart. She didn't want to be weaker than Rhaenys. When Rhaenys was able to go to the battlefield in person, she didn't know how envious she was at that time. She also hoped that she could grow up quickly and become a useful person. The choice of the 2 girls surprised him a little. The condemned prisoners screamed in the sea of fire, and even Viserys felt sorry for a second. However, these 5 condemned prisoners were all heinous robbers extracted from the Andalus prison. Thinking of their past deeds, Viserys became hard-hearted. His face remained unchanged, and he calmly watched the 5 condemned prisoners turn into vengeful flames. Born in the fire, exchanged lives, the last condition left was the blood of the real dragon. Swoosh, Viserys pulled out the Valyrian steel dagger from his waist. Since his physique reached the extraordinary realm, Viserys' own defense has also been greatly improved. He has not been injured for a long time, and it is not so easy for ordinary blades to easily stab him. Viserys held a Valyrian steel dagger and gently cut a wound on his finger, and blood gushed out instantly. Then he smeared the blood on his hand on the dragon eggs one by one, and the blood was quickly absorbed by the eggshell. This absorption of the blood of the real dragon is more efficient than being roasted by fire. Viserys is now immune to fire, and his fingers shuttle freely into the flames. What makes him stronger than Daenerys is that he didn't even burn the sweat hair on his hands. Being wrapped in flames is as comfortable as taking a hot spring. Not far away, it seems that something has been noticed. Valyrian and Viserion, who were resting on the ground, raised their heads from the ground at the same time and looked over. Caca. The next second, the sound of the eggshell breaking was clearly audible. Chapter 359 Female Dragon. Crack. The sound of the dragon egg breaking was clear. Viserys' eyes instantly fell on the first dragon egg to break out of its shell. It was a red dragon egg, like a burning flame, with a layer of scales attached to the surface. Rhaenys and Daenerys also looked over at the same time, their hearts slightly lifted. Although Daenerys had hatched a dragon before, she was asleep at that time, and it was completely in her dream. This was the first time the three people present saw a dragon breaking out of its shell. The red dragon egg was still shaking violently, and the cracks on the surface became more and more dense, covering the entire egg. Crack. Then, accompanied by a crisp sound, a small head covered with red scales came out first. With a pair of big watery eyes, it greedily breathed in the air outside. It seemed that it had been holding it in for a long time. So cute. The two girls present saw the cute appearance of the baby dragon and their eyes immediately sparkled with stars. Squeak. The red dragon that had just emerged from the eggshell struggled hard in the eggshell, as if trying to break out of the shell completely, and at the same time, made a sharp cry, like a large mouse, which surprised Viserys. Is the cry of a dragon so unpleasant? He turned to ask Daenerys, and the silver-haired girl herself was not very clear, and then she looked at Rhaenys again, because she was asleep at that time. Rhaenys hesitated slightly, then shook her head. She remembered that Valyrian, Regal, and Viserion had roared like a dragon when they were just hatched. Isn't this a dragon? Impossible. However, the few people present saw the dragon hatching for the first time, and they didn't know all the situations, so they could only continue to watch patiently. Then they saw that the dragon that broke out of the shell first was struggling in the dragon egg, and it seemed that the neck was stuck by the eggshell. Viserys' brows relaxed slightly, and then he reached out to help it. However, at this moment, Valyrion's low roar came from above his head. The yellow sand was stirred up, and a huge shadow covering the sky and the sun shrouded the ground. Two dragons sat in a row behind the three people, stretching their slender necks to observe the hatching of dragon eggs coldly. Valyrion conveyed a strong will in Viserys' mind to stop Viserys from doing so. The eggshell of the dragon egg is extremely hard, and the dragon breaking out of the shell is the first test of the gods for the dragon, a creature born against the will of heaven. Viserys understood Valyrion's meaning and stopped, and then saw the young dragon that broke out of the shell first ahead of its brothers and sisters, desperately twisting its body, bursting out with a strong will, and finally squeezed out a bigger hole in the dragon egg. Then he opened his mouth and bit the eggshell fiercely. Crack. The hard dragon eggshell suddenly became vulnerable under the sharp teeth of this little guy. A piece was bitten hard, and then chewed and swallowed. It turns out that they ate the eggshell. At this time, Rhaenys, who was watching, exclaimed softly. She lowered her voice very low for fear of disturbing the first red dragon hatching out of the shell. When the three dragons of Valyrion were hatched, Rhaenys had ordered the cleaning of the entire ruins of the main castle after the fire, but she never found the whereabouts of the dragon eggshell in the ruins. At that time, she thought that someone had secretly picked it up, but she didn't take it too seriously. After all, it was just an eggshell. Now it seems that the first step for a giant dragon to hatch is to eat all its own eggshells. The red dragon that first hatched greedily gnawed its own eggshell, as if it were some kind of delicacy. In the process, her scales seemed to become more and more shiny, reflecting the light of metal, and instantly became stiff from the soft appearance when it just hatched out of the shell. It seems that the eggshell of dragon eggs is the best supplement for young dragons, and it seems to contain magical power. Viserys calmly observed the changes of the red dragon and found that the other party had a slender body and delicate bones, but his eyes were slightly sharp. Could this little guy be a female dragon? The silver-haired young man's heart suddenly moved slightly. He had been worried about the future reproduction of the three brothers. Balerion, Regal and Viserion were all male dragons, so they were aggressive and had a strong desire to fight. However, no matter how strong the fighting power was, the three male dragons could not give birth to dragon babies and could not reproduce offspring to continue the race. Now they are the last three dragons in the world. Viserys did not want the dragon race to become extinct again in the future, so for the continuation of this race, finding a female dragon was something he had to put on the agenda. However, there are three mainstream guesses in the world about the reproduction of dragons. The first guess is that dragons have no gender. This view is held by Brother Bath, the hand of the king of the centenarian King Geharazai. He believes that the gender of dragons may be as fickle as dragon flames. The second guess is that dragons will show one gender for special reasons at certain stages, but it may not be fixed throughout their lives. The third is that dragons are divided into male and female like other species. Viserys got clear information from Balerion that he was a male dragon, and the remaining two brothers were the same. However, Viserys did not see obvious male reproductive organs from Balerion, and Balerion could not speak and could only convey simple emotions that could not be expressed clearly. However, one thing is certain, that if the dragon race wants to continue, it still needs the existence of female dragons. Viserys once had a bold guess that dragons are likely to reproduce asexually, and female dragons can lay dragon eggs without fertilization, while male dragons are mainly responsible for fighting enemies and defending their homes. There is no proof of the information left by the Targaryen family on Dragonstone, but it only explains that dragons do have the behavior of hatching eggs. If there is a female dragon in the family, she will be willing to hatch the eggs, regardless of whether they are laid by her or not, so there is no need for the Targaryen family members to hatch the eggs themselves. A dragon can lay at least 5 eggs at a time. The 5 dragon eggs that Viserys got from the Valyrian ruins are likely to be laid by a female dragon in one nest, and they have the same mother. While the little red dragon was gnawing at its eggshell in the flames, another golden dragon egg next to her began to shake. Crack! A crack appeared in the eggshell. Chapter 360. The four brothers and sisters of the Long family. The red dragon was in the middle, breaking out of its shell first, ahead of its brothers and sisters, becoming the eldest among the many dragons. The 5th golden dragon egg was not to be outdone, stubbornly smashing the eggshell with its head, and then struggling to get out of the eggshell. As soon as the dragon crawled out, it let out a childish roar, as if it was dissatisfied with not being the first. Then its eyes saw Balerion squatting behind the 3 people. The huge black death god exuded a strong heat all over his body, and golden magma flowed in the gaps between his scales, and even steam rose slightly. Its huge scalded eyes were calm, watching its offspring being born coldly. The second hatched little guy looked at Balerion and shrank his neck slightly in an instant. The howl that was venting dissatisfaction also lost its breath halfway and turned into 2 hums. Its body was covered with golden scales, reflecting the dazzling light under the raging fire, like a rising sun. This little fellow looks so beautiful, Rhaenys exclaimed sincerely as she looked at the dragon that was so close to her. Then the golden dragon also bit its own eggshell and began to eat it. As it ate its own eggshell, the light of its scales became stronger and stronger. The first one was a red female dragon, and the second one that broke out of the shell was a golden male dragon. Not long after the second dragon came out, the 3rd and 4th dragon eggs began to tremble almost at the same time. Another dragon is about to break out of the shell. They looked at each other, and before everyone, including Viserys, had time to look at the beautiful golden dragon, 2 more dragon eggs began to move. Who will be the 3rd brother or sister? Viserys' eyes were also fixed on the 2 trembling dragon eggs. One of them is a dark blue dragon egg placed in the first place, as deep blue as the ocean, and there is a vague vortex-like pattern. I don't know if it just grows like this, or has other meanings. One look at it will make you feel deeply trapped in it. The other one is light green, as crystal clear as a pearl. It is more like a gem or a work of art than a dragon egg or a stone. The 2 dragon eggs began to struggle to break out of the shell almost at the same time. According to the information conveyed by Balerian to Viserys, the earlier the dragon hatches, the stronger and healthier its physique is, and the more lively its personality is. If a nest of 5 dragon eggs begins to hatch at the same time, the last dragon egg will often become the dragon to be sacrificed. Because its physique is not as strong and healthy as its brothers and sisters, it is easy to die halfway. If there is a shortage of food, or in some more extreme situations, the mother dragon will give priority to giving up her last child. The red dragon was the first to break out of the shell, proving that she had the healthiest physique, followed by the golden dragon. Who would be the third dragon became the focus of attention of the 3 people and 2 dragons present. However, the 2 struggling dragon eggs did not leave the crowd in suspense for too long. Caca, a crack appeared on the surface of the deep blue dragon egg, which was as deep as the ocean, and then the green dragon egg, which was as transparent as a pearl, also cracked. Then the deep blue dragon was the first to break out of the shell and bit its own eggshell. It seemed that it took a lot of effort, and was a little out of breath. She had dark blue scales, a slender body, and a pair of quiet and gentle eyes. She looked like a gentle dragon. On the other side, the green pearl dragon also broke out of the shell. She saw that her brothers and sisters had broken out of the shell one after another, and she became the 4th, which made her a little depressed. Then she turned her grief and anger into strength, opened her mouth and bit her own eggshell fiercely, as if she was complaining that her eggshell was so hard. Then the light green dragon, which was also slender, gnawed its eggshell, swallowed it with its cheeks puffed up. As the light green dragon swallowed its eggshell, its dragon horns, the row of pointed bones on its neck, and the wing bones gradually became translucent, reflecting dazzling colorful light like crystal. Is this a crystal dragon? Viserys saw the changes that happened to the 4th female dragon after it gnawed its eggshell, and his eyes narrowed slightly. Seeing the changes of the previous few dragons, most of them had brighter dragon scales, but only the slight green dragon had a qualitative change, and its dragon horns, neck, and wing bones turned translucent, like a bright crystal. Wow, this dragon is really beautiful, even more beautiful than the golden dragon just now. Daenerys looked at the hatching of the crystal dragon, her purple eyes flashing with amazement. Behind the 3 of them, the white dragon Viserion, who was squatting beside his eldest brother, was slightly dissatisfied when he heard his partner's words and let out a roar. However, Viserion's temper and personality have always been good, and his manners and movements are elegant, just like a noble gentleman. It just vented its dissatisfaction slightly, and then said nothing more, and continued to calmly watch the cubs below. The birth of the crystal dragon is indeed very amazing, even if she is ranked 4th. The 3rd and 4th are female dragons, and the dark blue dragon, that looks unremarkable, is also a female dragon. After she ate her eggshell, she did not show the same bright and amazing changes as the crystal dragon. Instead, the scales around her body became deeper, the brilliance was restrained, and the ancient well was calm. Reverse breakthrough? When the 2 girls, Rhaenys and Daenerys, focused their attention on the beautiful little crystal dragon, Viserys' eyes fell on the 3rd sister of the dragon's brothers and sisters. He watched the changes of the dark blue dragon after eating the eggshell. However, the scales of her other brothers and sisters became brighter after eating the eggshell, but she seemed to have made a breakthrough in the opposite direction. After eating the eggshell, the only light seemed to disappear, just like an ugly duckling. If she curled up, she would even be mistaken for a stone. However, the dark blue dragon did not seem to be discouraged. After eating her eggshell, she stayed quietly in the same place and did not take the initiative to communicate with her eldest sister, 2nd brother and 4th sister. 4 of the 5 dragon eggs have successfully broken out of the shell. So then everyone and the dragon's eyes were focused on the last dragon egg. This is a silver dragon egg, and it seems that there is no movement so far. Asleep? Chapter 361 Naming. This dragon egg. Rhaenys crossed her fingers and said with a little worry, "Isn't it a dead egg?" Viserys frowned slightly. In fact, it was not impossible. There are also cases of dragon eggs failing to hatch. Not every dragon egg can hatch a baby dragon. If you encounter such a thing, you can only blame yourself for your bad luck. Balerion had lost interest in watching and walked back to the place where he had just rested with heavy steps and continued to lie down. Even if the baby dragon in this silver dragon egg can break out of the shell, the last dragon in a nest of dragon eggs is often looked down upon by the dragon. The eldest brother left, and the white gold dragon Viserion still squatted in the same place, slightly raised his slender neck, and let out a low dragon roar, as if he wanted to express something, but unfortunately he couldn't speak. Then he spread his wings, to block the scorching sun above the heads of the 3 people and 4 baby dragons below. The Black Death left here, and the 4 newly born dragons below were obviously relieved. Valerion's evil spirit was so strong that even the other 2 young dragons, Regal and Viserion, who had grown to more than 10 meters in size, were a little afraid of their big brother. At this time, a melodious and low dragon roar came from afar, and Regal finally flew back from afar. It returned here, after eating and drinking, and then found that there were 4 more dragon babies in the house. Boom. Regal's footsteps landed heavily on the ground, stirring up rolling dust. Regal made a puzzled sound, tilted his huge and ferocious head, and his bronze eyes flashed with puzzled light, but no one paid attention to it. Then the bronze dragon leaned down slightly, and its huge head gradually approached the young dragons below. Regal. Seeing this scene, Regal was a little worried, afraid that Regal would hurt these newly born dragons. Just as she was about to speak to stop him, Daenerys on the other side stopped her. Regal has no ill intentions, it's just a little curious. As the mother of dragons, although the 3 dragons have their own partners, Daenerys' partner is Viserion, and Regal's partner is Regal, but Daenerys still has a vague sense of communication with the 3 dragons. She can roughly guess what her children are thinking, but Rhaenys can't, which is also the reason why she obviously doesn't have a deep understanding of Regal. And Regal has a bad character, and often makes trouble. He doesn't seem to be as obedient as Valyrian and Viserion. The bronze dragon slowly brought its huge head closer, and the heavy breathing sound was clearly audible, like a low thunder. The 4 young dragons below suddenly became agitated, and seemed a little panicked. But then they seemed to gradually understand that the other party did not want to hurt them, and then they became much bolder. The 4th sister among the 4 brothers and sisters of the Long family, the young dragon with light green scales all over her body, her dragon horns, neck, and wing bones have all turned into translucent crystals. The little female dragon has a lively personality, and seems to be very brave. She was not afraid of Leja's huge head, even if it was not even enough for the other party to eat her in one bite. Then she stuck her head out, and pecked the other party's hard head lightly. Bang, the hard scales collided, making a crisp sound. Leja was stunned for a moment. Then he gently raised his huge head, and made a low sound. His breathing sounded like thunder, and his bronze eyes looked up and down at the little crystal dragon. The young dragon was not afraid to look up at each other. Then the 2 dragons, one big and one small, looked at each other in silence for a long time. Leja didn't know what he was thinking, and then he slowly turned his head without saying a word, and left the place with heavy steps. For the young dragons below, this place was like heaven. Although adult dragons are the overlords of the sky, they also need the existence of the tribe. Because they are just the size of a kitten, when they are born, they have no ability to survive, and having the protection of 3 elders is undoubtedly the safest environment. The mental state of the 4 young dragons now seems to be particularly active. After eating the dragon eggs, they keep crawling around in the same place, flapping their wings, as if they want to learn to spread their wings and fly. Because they just saw eagle falling from the sky, the feeling of the old leading the young is like returning to the eve of the doom of Valyria, when hundreds of dragons danced wildly. For the young dragons, they hid in the eggshells, and had no idea what kind of terrible disaster their parents had experienced hundreds of years ago. In the end, almost all the dragons did not escape from that land. This is the best growth environment for young dragons. Looking at the interaction between Regal and the young dragons just now, Viserys slowly spoke at this time. It is definitely better for them to learn the skills of dragons led by the elders in the tribe than to be trained by humans. Valyrian, Regal and Viserion had no one to teach them the skills of a dragon, so they could only rely on themselves to constantly test and explore. The 3 young dragons all had their own dragon riders, so they were not worried that the young dragons they brought out would become too wild and unwilling to obey. Give these young dragons a name. The flames had not yet gone out, swaying gently with the wind, and the last dragon egg was still motionless. Viserys was silent for a moment, then spoke. The 3 dragons were named according to their own wishes. Viserys had the ambition to emulate Aegon the Conqueror, and with the appearance of a black dragon, he named the black dragon Balerion, hoping that it could grow into the next Black Death. And Rhaenys named her dragon Regal in memory of her father Rhaegar. Daenerys had never seen her parents and elder brother since the day she was born, so the second brother Viserys had an extremely important and special position in the girl's heart. She named her dragon Viserion. Should we name them now? Rhaenys hesitated for a moment, then asked. But who will be their future companions? She felt that it would be best for the dragon riders to name the dragons. If one wanted to cultivate a relationship with their dragons, it would be best to start from childhood. It would be difficult for a dragon rider who took over halfway to have a deep relationship with their dragons. Dragons will always remember their first companions. But where can they find their dragon riders now? Rhaenys lowered her head and looked at the young dragons that were still crawling and trying to learn how to roar and fly. She suddenly felt a little distressed. There were too many dragons, but not enough people. Chapter 362. The name of the ancient god. To become a dragon's partner, one must have the blood of the Dragon King that can be recognized by the dragon, and now the 3 of them already have their own dragons. The relationship between a dragon and its dragon rider is similar to a marriage, and the relationship between them is extremely loyal, even far exceeding that of some humans. Only when the dragon rider dies in battle, illness, or old age will the dragon look for its next partner. And the dragon rider is not dead. Only when his dragon dies in battle can he look for the next suitable dragon. Therefore, the 3 will not become the dragon riders of the 4 dragons. However, because of the dragon eggs that Viserys hatched himself, the 4 dragons will regard him as their father and have a special connection with Viserys, just like the relationship between the 3 dragons and Daenerys. At present, the members of the Targaryen family are only these 3 people in front of him, and Viserys has never considered Aegon's affairs. If he wants to ride a dragon, he also needs the approval of the dragon. Aegon and Balerion had met before, but it was obvious that Balerion had never looked at him straight in the eye. It was either because the Targaryen blood in his body was too thin, or because he did not have the blood of the Dragon King at all, even though he had long silver hair and purple eyes. Although Rhaenys inherited most of her mother's appearance and did not look like a Targaryen, her Targaryen blood was also pure. After all, her father was the eldest brother of Viserys and Dany. If you think about it this way, Viserys suddenly thought that the 4 young dragons in front of him would most likely be the companions of the descendants of the 3 people present in the future. Perhaps when the children grow up, the 4 young dragons in front of him will have grown into behemoths that are even larger than Balerion now. They are the founding ancestors of the new Targaryen dynasty, and the family will be passed down from their hands in the future. Viserys glanced at Daenerys and Rhaenys, and suddenly felt that he did not know how to explain it. After all, except for the coming of age ceremony he held, the 2 girls were not yet adults. Then the silver-haired young man chose to keep silent. Viserys did not speak, and Daenerys hesitated for a moment. She really did not have any better ideas, and naming a dragon should be done with some care. After all, dragons are very smart. Otherwise, if they knew that she was the one who gave them their names, they would come to kill them. Daenerys hesitated for a moment, then pointed at the last beautiful little female dragon with a crystal clear dragon horn on her head and said, "She is so beautiful, how about calling her Pearl?" When Viserys and Rhaenys heard the name given by the silver-haired girl, they immediately raised their hands and supported their foreheads. "Forget it, you'd better not give her a name." Then Rhaenys sighed. "Humph, if you don't want to give her a name, then don't give her a name." Daenerys saw that the 2 were laughing at the name she gave, and her face suddenly darkened. As she grew older, Daenerys was no longer as shy as she was when she was a child, and her personality became much more lively. Rhaenys pondered for a moment. She was a few years older than Daenerys, and she was studying hard at Viserys' request. Viserys did not treat the 2 girls as vases, but trained them as heirs, hoping that they would be able to stand on their own in the future. Then Rhaenys suddenly thought of a name and spoke. "Brother, your dragon is called Balerion. I remember it was named after an ancient Valyrian god, right?" Privately, Rhaenys was more accustomed to calling Viserys brother. Viserys was slightly stunned, then nodded, as if he had guessed Rhaenys' thoughts. That's right. You want to. We can name the remaining dragons after the ancient gods of Valyria. There are many ancient gods in Valyrian culture, including the faceless goddess statue with a single horn that Viserys collected, and the rest include Vagar, Meryxes, and Syrinx. If all the dragons are really named after the ancient gods of Valyria, recreating the names of the famous dragons during the Targaryen dynasty, this undoubtedly shows an extremely magnificent ambition, not only wanting to regain the Iron Throne, but also intending to restore the territory of the Valyrian freehold, as far as the ancient Gis Empire area and the trading city-states actually grew up, by gnawing on the corpses of Valyria. And Viserys pondered for a moment, and finally nodded slightly. Okay. Name the 4 baby dragons after the ancient gods of Valyria. Then the first red dragonlet shall be named Vagar. Viserys looked at the eldest of the 4 brothers and sisters of the dragon family. The red dragonlet was the first to break out of the shell. Although her body was slender, her eyes were sharp, and she looked extremely fierce. She was destined to be an Iron Lady in the future. Vagar's name was an ancient female god of Valyria, and she was also the largest female dragon in the history of Westeros, with a long lifespan that was almost comparable to Balerion. During the Dance of the Dragons, it was said that Vagar's roar could make Storm's End tremble. Her ferocity was unmatched by any dragon. At this time, the red dragonlet also let out a childish dragon roar, as if it understood that Viserys was naming her. Her roar had changed dramatically in a short period of time after she was born, and she had some of the embryonic form of a sky overlord. The second golden dragon is called Terex. Terex is also an ancient god from the Valyrian freehold period. In High Valyrian, it means sun and light, and is a sun god in Valyrian civilization. It just fits the golden dragon's golden scales, like a small sun. Meryxes is a sea serpent in Valyrian mythology. It is said that it can call the wind and rain and stir up huge waves. The dark blue dragon roared, and she was named the ancient god Siren Meryx. And the last dragon Syrinx, a pure girl. Her name also comes from the name of a Valyrian goddess. Although her partner may not be such a woman. Queen Rhaenyra Targaryen launched a civil war known as the Dance of the Dragons, which directly led to the death of a large number of dragons of the Targaryen family and the extinction of dragons. At this point, the 4 dragons had been named: Red Dragon Vagar, Gold Dragon Terex, Dark Blue Young Dragon Meryx, Crystal Dragon Little Lady Syrinx. At this moment, the raging fire that hatched the 4 young dragons was about to go out, leaving only the last remaining flames dancing in the charred ruins. The last silver dragon egg shook at this time, rolled on the scorched earth, and the eggshell of the dragon egg finally cracked. Crack. A young dragon covered with silver scales looked a little weak, and finally crawled out of the eggshell panting. Chapter 363, Winterfell Cellar. In the cellar of Winterfell, it was quiet all around, with only faint breathing sounds, no light at all, and pitch dark. A man in black clothes with long dark brown hair was holding a sword, wearing a wolfskin, leaning against the wall of the cellar and sleeping soundly. At this moment, he suddenly frowned in his sleep, and then his breathing suddenly became rapid. A companion leaning on him was not asleep yet. He was experienced, and had a very fast reaction speed. Perhaps there were too many terrible things recently, which caused him to wake up suddenly at the slightest movement. He suddenly covered Benjen's mouth, making him swallow the exclamation in his mouth back into his stomach, and only made a little dull sound. Woo. However, just this weak sound made everyone in the cellar suddenly wake up, and there was a slight commotion. At the same time, a slight sound came from the upper floor of the cellar. Oh no. In an instant, everyone's heart was hanging. Fortunately, after this subtle sound, there was no other sound, and the people hiding deep in the cellar breathed a sigh of relief. Hey, what's wrong with you? Do you know that you almost killed all of us, Benjen? The person who spoke in a low voice was Aliza Thorne, the Night's Watch coach of Castle Black. He has rich combat experience, and is now in his 40s. It was his quick reaction that saved everyone's lives. Otherwise, once the demons outside were attracted, the last safe place in Winterfell would fall. When he was young, Aliza Thorne had fought for the Targaryen family in the War of the Usurper, and refused to surrender when King's Landing fell. He fought to the last moment until he was captured alive. Lord Tywin Lannister asked him to choose between a noose and a black coat. He chose to put on a black coat and came to the Night's Watch. The long-faced man, who was still in shock, was also breathing heavily at this moment. He also realized that what had just happened was extremely dangerous. His chest was heaving, but there seemed to be panic in his eyes. He had a nightmare. He was none other than Benjen Stark, the chief ranger of the Night's Watch. However, after taking a few deep breaths, Benjen's heart gradually calmed down. "Sorry, Sir Aliza." Then Benjen looked at his colleague of the Night's Watch gratefully, not knowing whether he could see in such a dark situation, and apologized to him. Then he took a deep breath, calmed his mind again, and spoke in a low voice. "I'm fine. I just had a nightmare." Nightmare. The middle-aged knight with grey hair embraced his long sword and turned his head to look at Benjen. He originally thought that Benjen was already a battle-hardened warrior and should not have a nightmare in such a situation, but he did not expect that he still overestimated him and turned out to be a coward. Aliza Thorne sneered, then shook his head and said, "It's okay, I understand." In his opinion, Benjen was scared. However, what happened in the past year was indeed terrible. From the first contact with the figure of the White Walkers, the terrifying array of corpses, to the war with the wildlings, the collapse of the wall, and then the arrival of the White Walker army, the fall of the wall, and the defeat of the coalition forces to Winterfell. A month ago, the coalition forces were ready to fight back in Winterfell, but they were still defeated. After a night of fighting, the coalition forces fled to the neck. They were surrounded by the whites and could not rush out. In a panic, they had to flee into the cellar of Winterfell. During this month, the whites from the outside world had heard the noise and rushed in several times. After constant dealings, sacrifices, and fighting, there are only so many people left now. Fortunately, Winterfell was built on a hot spring, and the temperature in the cellar was not very cold. Moreover, the cellar of Winterfell was once temporarily requisitioned as a place for the coalition forces to store supplies, so they did not have to worry about food and clothing. However, the food that the coalition had stored up was running out, and for everyone trapped here, it was time to make a decision. Benjen naturally heard the sarcasm in Aliza Thorne's words, but he was no longer a hot-blooded child in his teens or 20s. He just glanced at the other party and said nothing. After all, he had made a mistake just now, and the other party had saved everyone present. After the brief conversation, the entire cellar of Winterfell fell into silence again. Benjen leaned against the wall behind him, his eyes flickering slightly. Although his mentality had stabilized, he could no longer fall asleep. Although he couldn't see it with his eyes open, he knew that the statue of Edric Stark, the King of Snaubad, was opposite him. Because when he was a child, he often ran to the cellar to play, and his sister Lyanna would tell him some stories about his ancestors. Edric the Snaubad King is considered the ancestor of the Stark family, and one of the earliest kings in the north. The outer wall of Winterfell was built in the last period of his reign. Since the cellar was breached by the dead, they have paid a bloody lesson. Now the survivors have fled to the bottom of the cellar, and the collapsed area is below. But these are not the main points. The main point is that Benjen had a nightmare after he accidentally fell asleep. Benjen dreamed that the King of the Kingdom of Winter appeared in the cellar of Winterfell. His cold eyes locked on him, and then he strode towards him. The stone direwolves on both sides of the cellar ordered him, as if asking him to run away. His father Rickard Stark, his eldest brother Brandon, and his sister Lyanna were all shedding tears of blood and telling him to leave here quickly. Benjen ran back desperately, and the Night King chased him slowly from behind. But then something even more terrifying happened, which made Benjen's hair stand on end, and he was instantly terrified. That was the tombs of the kings of the north that the Night King passed by exploded one after another, and the kings of the north who had once been powerful and left a strong mark in history climbed out of the tombs. They pulled out the rusty swords on their statues, and with a touch of their hands, they all turned into transparent ice swords. Ice blue flames danced in their eyes, and then they all looked at Benjen, who was lying on his side at the end of the cellar, and roared together to shake the soul. Then Benjen was awakened. Chapter 364 Horrible Nightmare. Just a nightmare. Benjen was still a little frightened after being awakened. but after realizing it was a nightmare, he had a brief chat with Sir Eliza Thorne, and his inattention and anxiety gradually dissipated. Then he exhaled a long breath. I hope it's just a nightmare. But although it was just a nightmare, for some reason Benjamin still felt a little inexplicably uneasy. How much food do we have left? There was silence in the deepest part of the cellar, and everyone seemed to have fallen asleep again. At this time, the chief ranger spoke again abruptly, but his voice was still very low. Only 3 days at most. This time it was not Eliza Thorne's turn to speak. The Night's Watch recruiting officer Wandering Crow Yoren, who was sitting opposite Benjamin, spoke in a low voice. Only 3 days. Benjamin's heart tightened slightly when he heard this. He knew that there was not much food left, but he didn't expect that there was only so much left in the cellar at the bottom. There are quite a lot of supplies stored in the cellars of Winterfell, but most of them are on the upper floors. However, during this month of hiding, due to various accidents, they have been forced to flee to the lowest floor, to the presence of an ancestor like King Zuhu. You know, the older the tomb, the deeper and darker it is buried. There are more ancestral tombs of the Stark family, but they are already in a collapsed area, which is already quite dangerous. Therefore, the food reserves here are not much, and only the last 3 days of rations are left. Sure enough, when Yoren's voice fell, all the survivors present were slightly agitated. Now there are only a few dozen people left who have escaped to the lowest floor of the cellar. Among these people are the Night's Watch and the allied soldiers. Most of them are soldiers from the north, and there are 2 Westerlings and soldiers from the Reach. There are only 3 days of food and water. What should we do? In the darkness, it is impossible to see the face clearly, and we can only listen to the voice to determine the position. Someone spoke anxiously, but the voice seemed a little loud, causing a commotion on the upper floor of the cellar. In an instant, everyone tacitly quieted down. After a long while, there was no new movement, and everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Sir Eliza Thorne clenched his fist slightly, and scolded in a low voice with some annoyance. Have you forgotten the mistakes you made some time ago? Do you still want to die together? After all, Sir Eliza had been the commander of the Targaryen army, and he was experienced and prestigious. In addition, he was over 40 years old, and he could be called the father of many people present. Therefore, everyone kept silent when he scolded. But after another long while, someone finally couldn't help but ask again in a low voice, but this time the emotion was better controlled, and there was no anxiety just now. After all, everyone has been trapped here for a month. In this month, they haven't even had a good sleep. They are worried every day, and live in a completely silent environment. Everyone is numb to fear. Death. If they really die, it will be a relief. What should we do? Are we going to starve to death in 3 days? As his voice fell, there was silence in the cellar, and everyone's breathing was a little heavy. This is indeed a problem that is about to be faced. Although there is water, without food, they will starve to death sooner or later. The food stored in the bottom layer is not much. At this time, Benjamin took a deep breath and said abruptly, the food is on the upper 2 layers, but we threw it away. There are only 2 ways after 3 days. Either stay here and starve to death and become a white to crawl up and wander in the mausoleum in a daze, or rush out. Benjamin's words made sense, but they made everyone present silent. They had thought about rushing out before, but in an attempt about half a month ago, they suffered heavy losses and were forced to flee back and escape to the bottom layer. During this period, because they could not see the outside, it was very troublesome to calculate the days. They calculated the past time by listening to the footsteps of the whites above their heads. Although there may be some omissions, this is also a helpless solution. Wait to die, or die now. This question is very heavy, but for the people trapped in the deepest part of the cellar, this is the problem they are facing. I support rushing out. At this time, the Night's Watch's recruiting officer Yoren spoke in support. I'd rather fight these bastards than starve to death here. His words resonated with some soldiers. They had been trapped here for more than a month, and even numb to fear, and the hope of survival was gradually slimming. Since the defeat, they have not obtained any information from the outside world, and they don't know what the outside world is like now. Humanity is defeated. Is the Neck Marsh defended? Maybe the future is the end of the world. The army of the dead has captured King's Landing and turned everyone into whites, whether they are poor farmers or the high kings or nobles. In this way, they feel more balanced, at least everyone's end is the same. The long night is shrouded, Westeros has completely become a ghost den, and there are zombies everywhere. It seems that there is no difference between dying early and late. Anyway, hope no longer exists. It is better to fight these monsters to the death, and die more heroically. I'll go. I support it. Just kill it. Yoren's words received a positive response from everyone, but Sir Aliza still seemed very calm. In fact, he was a little inclined to the plan of fighting to the death, because the current situation was very obvious, and waiting would only lead to death. Now that so much time had passed in the outside world, there might not be so many whites left in Winterfell. If he seized the opportunity, he might really be able to fight his way out. Have you thought about it, Benjen? Then Sir Aliza, whose hair was a little grey, spoke hoarsely. If you rush out with your brothers, there will be no turning back. Either escape or die on the way. Well, no hesitation. Benjen took a deep breath, then nodded and spoke firmly. He suppressed the increasing uneasiness in his heart and touched the dragon crystal dagger in his arms. Now there are only 3 people present who have dragon crystal daggers, 3 of whom are from the Night's Watch. These 3 dragon crystal daggers were distributed to them in the Night's Watch basement before the collapse of the wall. In fact, Benjen did not mention that the reason why he suddenly encouraged everyone to rush out from here at this time was due to his inner uneasiness and the nightmare not long ago. His father, elder brother, and sister Lyanna warned him with tears and blood to leave here quickly. Go. Then, Benjen drew out the long sword in his arms and stood up. Dozens of soldiers trapped here also clenched their weapons and rushed out behind Benjen. Outside Winterfell, in the heavy snow, a skeleton horse was carrying a thin man with an ice crown on his head and slowly walked towards the gate of Winterfell. His eyes were burning with ice blue flames. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 365, Escape. Kill. Dozens of surviving soldiers came out from the bottom of the Stark cemetery with torches in their hands, catching the whites off guard. However, these whites were not afraid. Their bodies had long been dead, and now they only relied on some mysterious power to maintain their activities. Their brains would not function, and they blindly executed the orders of the Night King. Then the whites let out a shrill howl and pounced on the group of human soldiers. The power of life was like a beacon in the dark and a pile of shit that attracted flies to these dead people, attracting them all. The whites swarmed in, and dozens of survivors drew their swords and fought. Benjen was the leader of this group of soldiers. Sir Aliza Thorne was the coach of the Night's Watch, but Benjen was the chief ranger. The positions of the two were similar, and neither could command the other. However, most of the surviving soldiers were from the north, and they were naturally willing to obey the orders of a member of the Stark family, rather than the words of a southerner who came from nowhere. The light of a torch illuminated the dark cellar. The gals relied on their instinct to look for any signs of life. In such a dark environment, human eyes were not as sensitive as the gals. Fortunately, there were a lot of war supplies stored in the cellar. In addition to food, there were also armor, weapons, kerosene, and firewood. Kill. Then the man with dark brown hair and a long face, wearing black animal skin, held a long sword in one hand under the light of the torch, and rushed to the front. The gals on the upper floor of the cellar saw the living people howling, and rushed over directly. Then Banan dodged nimbly, and chopped off his head with a backhand sword. However, after the gal's head was chopped off, his body was still scratching and biting randomly. The head that fell to the ground could not make a cry, but the dark blue in the eyes was still clearly visible, flashing with madness. Then the chief ranger moved very quickly, and the obsidian dagger in his left hand directly pierced into the chest of the headless gal. Puff. The dragon crystal dagger was extremely sharp, even sharper than weapons made of steel, but it was relatively fragile and suitable for ending the enemy's life rather than fighting. The dagger pierced into the chest of the headless white, just like piercing into the body of a scarecrow, without any feeling of flesh and blood. The white's movements froze in an instant, and then as if all the strength was taken away, the body collapsed limply, completely dead. The body of a headless wight was killed, but his head was still opening its mouth and making a continuous clacking sound, as if it wanted to bite the human toes. Snap, but it was stomped to pieces by Yoran, the wave crow who rushed up from behind. Another wight also rushed up, and then Yoran held a torch and stuffed it directly into the wight's mouth, burning the other party and screaming, and then killed the other party with the dragon crystal dagger. The sudden outburst of human survivors alarmed the wights in the entire Winterfell, and all the wights rushed here. Now, only a few dozen survivors were left, surrounded by them. The survivors had already rushed out of the dark cellar and came to the ground of Winterfell. They formed a circle to deal with the enemies from all directions and were caught in a bitter battle. Kaka, Sir Alizathorn chopped down a wight that rushed over with a sword, his chest heaving and panting, and white mist came out of his mouth. Beside him, a soldier from the Carstark family was thrown to the ground by a wight and bit his cheek frantically, making a shrill scream. Damn it. Then the coach of the Black Castle, who had a little grey hair, took out the dragon crystal dagger and stabbed it into the back of the wight fiercely. The wight screamed and was unable to move and died immediately, but the face of the soldier from the Carstark family had been bitten and died in a pool of blood. Benjen, we can't fight here. Otherwise everyone will die here. Sir Aliza waved his sword and fought desperately while shouting loudly at Benjen. The chief ranger naturally understood this truth. The black-haired long-faced man gritted his teeth and scanned the surrounding environment. More and more wights were gathering. The gate of Winterfell was closed by the wights for some reason. There was no time to rush over and seize the gate. The only choice was to go to the nearest wall. Follow me. Then Benjen gritted his teeth and led the remaining survivors to fight their way out of the siege and kill towards the wall. In fact, they were lucky. After so long, there were indeed not many wights left in Winterfell. There were probably only a few hundred wandering zombies. Otherwise, tens of thousands of wights would stay here, and even if each of these dozens of people was possessed by the mountain, they would not be able to rush out. Kill. Benjen still led the way and led the soldiers to rush towards the wall. The surviving soldiers also burst out with a strong will and paid a tragic price. They actually broke out of the encirclement of the wights and escaped to the wall. Ho! The wights howled sharply and chased after them frantically. Now that such a long time has passed since the great battle, there are still traces of the war on the walls of Winterfell. The blood was spilt wantonly, the flag of the Stark family was broken, the emblem of the dire wolf had a big hole burned out, the broken walls also had traces of being burned black by the flames, and the arrows were densely scattered in the quiver. However, even so, the thick snow on the ground still covered most of the traces, and the story of the hard battles of humans here was buried under the frost. Then Benjen kicked the unused kerosene on the top of the city wall, threw the torch in his hand down, and ignited the kerosene. In an instant, the fire blazed, blocking the wights from climbing up the wall. The chief ranger panted slightly, then turned and came to the charred battlements. He held the battlements and looked at the deep height below, and then looked at the remaining people around him who had been killed or injured in just a short moment. The man's throat moved, and he swallowed lightly. Silence was better than words at this moment. No words were needed. Everyone already knew what to do. They gritted their teeth and nodded to each other to show encouragement. Benjen was the first to climb the battlement and then jumped down without hesitation. Then came Alizathorn, who was already in his 40s, Yoran, the Raven, and the remaining surviving coalition soldiers, only a dozen of them in total, who jumped off the battlement one after another. Not far away, flames and thick smoke suddenly rose in Winterfell. The Night King, riding a skeleton horse, turned his head, with ice blue flames burning in his eyes. He saw everything that had just happened, and also saw them jumping off the wall. However, the Night King was not going to chase them. There were only a dozen humans struggling to survive, so it was not worth it for him to take action personally. They stayed in this land shrouded in cold, and death would embrace them sooner or later. Then the Night King urged his horse into Winterfell, and with his footsteps, the wind and snow in Winterfell became stronger. And in the cellar of Winterfell, shrouded in darkness, the tombs of successive kings of the north seemed to suddenly tremble slightly. The dust above fell down with a rustle, and the gravel trembled. Chapter 366 Prince Daolang's Plan. The morning sun enveloped Pentus in a corner of the spacious parade grounds in the nine-towered palace. The servants and guards passing by did not dare to stop, but looked over there intentionally or unintentionally. A female knight in bright armor and a snow-white cloak held the hilt of her sword with one hand and guarded here. Clang clang. The sound of metal colliding continuously rang out from this corner. A baron, the acting prime minister, held a spear and wielded it vigorously. The other man was a little shorter than him and looked a little thin. He held an ordinary one-handed sword. He faced a baron's stormy attack, but he seemed particularly at ease. Irian, who was walking towards this side with her long skirt in her hand, was slightly surprised when she saw this scene. A baron was her uncle, and the name of Red VIP was well known throughout Dawn. Viserys was his fiancé. Although he was also known as a fierce general in Essos, he often charged forward on the battlefield, underestimated the enemy and advanced rashly, but was able to retreat unscathed, and created the myth of 200 people capturing the city. But it was too late when she arrived in Pentus. Viserys no longer needed to take action himself, so she had never seen how good Viserys' swordsmanship was. The spear pierced into the air close to the silver-haired young man's ear, but Viserys just tilted his head. Then there was another sweep, but Viserys still dodged it by bending down slightly. At this moment, people with eyes had already seen that the victory and defeat had been decided, and the female knight was not surprised by Viserys' strength, because she had seen the silver-haired young man fight the general of the Freehold who was wearing full Valyrian steel armor and holding a dragon steel sword in the ruins of Valyria. The opponent was more than 7 feet tall and had infinite strength, like a giant. Maya felt that she could be smashed into the ground by the opponent with one punch, and she couldn't get out. The humans in the outside world probably couldn't imagine how terrible such a monster was, and what secrets this world was hiding. Viserys could kill such a giant monster in an instant, let alone these mortals. Yes, mortals. In Maya's view, her king was like a god. He mastered the black magic that was circulated in the ruins of Valyria, which could bring the dead back to life and turn himself into black mist. How could such a person still be among mortals? The battle continued. After several rounds, the two seemed to be evenly matched, but in fact the winner was already decided. Viserys finally fought back. The offensive on the scene suddenly changed. The ordinary longsword penetrated the barrier formed by a baron's superb spear skills and easily found the pain point of the opponent's moves. He forced the opponent to throw away the weapon in his hand, and then the longsword stopped about a foot away from a baron's throat. Snap, then sheathed the sword. Maya, who was standing aside, was also a battle-hardened warrior, but the scene just now made her a little dazzled. She barely saw Viserys' movements, how he forced the opponent to drop his weapon, and then he smoothly put his sword against the opponent's throat. The winner was decided. A baron raised his empty hands high, a little bitter on his face. His spear was thrown to the ground, and then he put his hands down. And Viserys also threw the sword in his hand back to the guard standing on the other side, who was also amazed. This sword was just borrowed from him. At this time, Irian, who had secretly watched for a while on the other side, walked over slowly with her skirt lifted. Amazing duel. Uncle a baron. She greeted her uncle first, and then looked at Viserys. The woman leaned very close, her hand naturally placed on his chest, and kissed him on the side of his face. Viserys could even smell her fragrance. My love. Irian also paid more attention to the king's good next to Viserys. The other person's face was not very beautiful, it could only be considered normal, but she looked more heroic after wearing armor. She had a good figure, but Irian's figure was still better. Irian didn't think that the first female king's good in history, appointed by Viserys, would challenge her position. When the female knight saw the Princess of Dawn, she lowered her head slightly with one hand on the hilt of the sword and spoke calmly. Your Highness. Sir. Irian nodded and greeted the king's good symbolically. Then her eyes fell on Viserys and her uncle again, and then she took out a letter from her arms and handed it to Viserys. Father has sent another letter, asking when we will send troops to Westeros. During this period, Prince Doran had actually sent several letters to Pentus in succession, asking when to send troops to Westeros. The Targaryen family and the Martell family are an unbreakable alliance. Prince Doran was very cautious in using troops, but because the two sides were far apart, it was best to agree on the time of sending troops in order to form the strongest combined force and avoid information asymmetry. He believed that the best opportunity was when the coalition of the Seven Kingdoms went to the wall. In the previous letters, Prince Doran proposed that the Targaryen army cross the Narrow Sea, take 3 dragons to King's Landing, and capture the family of the usurper to form a threat. Viserys took the lead in ascending the Iron Throne and was officially crowned King of the Seven Kingdoms. Then he issued an edict to denounce the usurper as a false king and ordered all the nobles in the Seven Kingdoms to surrender, winning the support of the fence-sitters, except Robert's staunch allies. At the same time, Dorne also attacked the south from 3 directions. Although the Reach was rich, the Rose of Highgarden had never been good at fighting and could not fight against the strong Dorne. And the Tyrell family itself was wavering, and it was easy to surrender directly to the Targaryen family. At that time, Viserys led the Targaryen soldiers south to join the Dornish army to attack Storm's End, the home of the Baratheon family. The young and incompetent Lord Renly Baratheon of Storm's End was not his brother Stannis. He could not withstand the onslaught of the Dornish and Targaryen armies, not to mention the 3 dragons. Once Storm's End was captured, it would be another heavy blow to the usurper. So far, the Seven Kingdoms were divided into 2. The Targaryen army controlled the south of the Seven Kingdoms, while Robert and his allies controlled the north of the Seven Kingdoms, and the forces of both sides were clearly divided. Prince Doran's plan was very good. If it succeeded, it would directly take Robert's life. But unfortunately, Dorne was too far away from Pentos. After the letter arrived, the situation in the Seven Kingdoms changed dramatically. Perhaps Prince Doran did not expect that the powerful coalition army would be defeated so quickly and so thoroughly. Viserys finished reading the letter and then handed it to Oberyn. After Oberyn finished reading it, the two looked at each other. At this time, a guard hurried over. "Your Majesty, the usurper sent a messenger to see you. He holds the order of the false king's hand and claims to be the Minister of Finance Petty Baelish." Chapter 367, The Iron Throne Emissary. This was not the first time Petty Baelish came to Pentos. The last time he came here was at the recommendation of the Prime Minister Jon Arryn, and he came here on the orders of King Robert to lobby the Free Cities to form an anti-Andalus alliance. This was a suggestion made by Tywin Lannister, the Duke of Casterly Rock, who came to King's Landing to meet King Robert after hearing about the death of his last brother Gillian. It was well known that Duke Tywin hated the remnants of the Targaryen. Both of his brothers died at the hands of that little bastard. Unfortunately, Duke Tywin's plan failed. Petty's plan to lobby the Free Cities was very successful, alienating the relationship between Bravos and Andalus, and successfully instigated the governor of Pentos to take advantage of the invitation to attack Viserys. But the final result was that Viserys went to the meeting alone and killed all the governors of Pentos in the chaos. Finally, he captured Pentos and broke through the anti-Andalus alliance. From then on, no force could restrict the development of Andalus. The final result of Petty's last mission to Pentos was not very good, and this time, Littlefinger was even more uneasy. He didn't want to come because he had done something wrong, but he didn't expect that because of his excellent performance last time. The damn old man Jon Arryn and King Robert valued him very much and asked Petty to come in person. So Littlefinger had to bite the bullet and come. He had Jon Arryn's order in his heart, as well as Queen Cersei's secret instructions, and he also had his own little tricks. Lord Petty Baelish's territory was only the smallest little finger on the Five Fingers Peninsula, so he had such an insulting nickname, but he was not angry, and even used it as an incentive. His lifelong wish was to improve his class and desire for power, hoping to become a great man. Therefore, he was willing to become a lackey for power, but this lackey would not be loyal to his master. Petty Baelish felt a lot of pressure for a visit with 3 intentions, but he was not discouraged. He stood outside the seaside palace in Pentos and took a deep breath to calm down. Then he turned his head and looked at Henry Bracken beside him. The brown-haired young man standing beside him also looked a little nervous. Feeling the gaze of Lord Petty Baelish, he turned his head and looked at him. Then Petty showed a calm smile on his face, patted Henry Bracken's shoulder and said encouragingly, "Don't be nervous, Henry. You are here to see your father. Your father once saved the life of His Royal Highness, and now he is also highly regarded and holds a high position in Pentus. Your Highness will never embarrass you if he embarrasses anyone. The two people are of similar age, but Petty Beelish has a calm temperament, as if an elder is educating a younger generation. Henry Bracken naturally lowered his head to the other party. After hearing what Lord Petty said, he took a deep breath and nodded, and seemed to be really relaxed. His father was a high-ranking official in the Targaryen prince's place, and His Highness would never embarrass him. Well, I'm here to see my father. Henry emphasized it again, and received Petty's encouraging smile, and a smile appeared on his face. Standing behind the two, King Robert's Kingsguard Captain Barristan Selmy was silent throughout the conversation. Petty Beelish represented King Robert on a legitimate mission. Unlike the last conspiracy, he naturally had to be accompanied by a Kingsguard. Because he stayed in the Red Castle, but disdained politics and was alone, he was dissatisfied and excluded by various forces. Although the two often quarreled because of differences on certain issues, Barristan's biggest backer was King Robert, who admired this outspoken Kingsguard captain very much. However, King Robert had been away from King's Landing for more than a year, so this upright captain of the Kingsguard was disliked by some people and was a nuisance. They conspired to drive him out of King's Landing to carry out this escort mission. Barristan Selmy also had mixed emotions about this trip because he was a member of King Aerys II's Kingsguard and swore loyalty to the king, but in the end he surrendered to the usurper. If it was just like this, it would be fine. After all, people would forget about it after a while, but the Targaryen family stood up again on the other side of the narrow sea. The escaped Targaryen Prince II inherited the will of his father and brother, and rebuilt the kingdom, which made him feel a little conflicted and complicated. Will His Royal Highness the Second Prince be a different person from his father? The White Knight was thinking wildly. He had seen His Royal Highness the Second Prince when he was a child, and even held him in his arms. But Barristan never thought that the most outstanding offspring of the late king was not his eldest son Rhaegar, but his second son, His Royal Highness Viserys. At this time, the door of the palace was opened. The three envoys who had come all the way from King's Landing had been standing outside the palace for a long time. The two unsullied soldiers were wearing light armor, and their eyes under their helmets were cold and indifferent. Lord Petty Beelish, please come in. His Majesty will see you when he has time. Thank you. The short man with a small tuft of beard on his chin nodded and smiled elegantly and politely. Then he entered the Night House Palace with Henry Bracken, the captain of the Kingsguard, and his entourage. Viserys had naturally been waiting here for a long time. He did not deliberately change his clothes and wore a crown that symbolized the king. He would do this in the past because he had no strength and needed to use some external costumes to deliberately emphasize his status and consolidate his rule. But now he no longer does that. He holds the power that can threaten the Seven Kingdoms. The nobles of the Seven Kingdoms are trembling under his shadow. It is only a matter of time before they send troops to attack Westeros. The female knight stood behind him, holding the hilt of a Valyrian steel sword in one hand. The commander of the Unsullied, Blackworm, also stood at the foot of the stairs not far away, holding a spear. The two rows of Unsullied soldiers looked solemn. A moment later, footsteps were heard outside the hall. The rest of the delegation was blocked outside. Only Petty, Henry, and the captain of the Kingsguard were allowed to enter the hall. Little Fina walked hurriedly, changing his calmness just now, and putting on an anxious look. When he saw Viserys, he didn't dare to look at him anymore, but bowed to the bottom with one hand on his chest. Greetings, Your Highness the Second Prince. Chapter 368 Seeking Help. The Usurper's Messenger. Lord Beelish. The one standing before you is the King of the Seven Kingdoms and the Protector of the Realm, not some second prince. Viserys did not speak, but the female knight standing behind him held the hilt of her sword with one hand and spoke in a cold voice in the broken common language. After a period of adaptation, Maya has now repeatedly understood the grievances and entanglements between the Targaryen family and the Iron Throne of Westeros, which is also her job. Petty Beelish showed a slightly formulaic but a smile on his face, and then bowed again. Okay, Your Majesty. Of course he knew that he had to call Viserys the king, but due to his position, he could not show himself too humble. A worthless commodity cannot be sold at a price. All this was in his preset opening remarks, and Petty was not panicked at all, and then he sorted out his words, and continued to speak. You may not have heard of my humble name when we first meet. Please allow me to introduce myself to you. My name is Petty Beelish. I come from the smallest finger of the Five Fingers Peninsula, and now I serve as the Minister of Finance in the Royal Council of His Majesty Robert Baratheon I. Although he was not very old, there were a few grey hairs in his dark hair. Petty Beelish stood in the hall and talked freely without any stage fright. He put his status very low and did not hide the fact that he was just from an inconspicuous small family, but he also emphasized his current status. As the Minister of Finance of King Robert, he was qualified to meet Viserys as an envoy, and the two standing next to me. Then Lord Beelish turned around and wanted to introduce the two people standing next to Viserys. However, at this moment, Viserys, who was sitting on the throne in a light-colored casual dress, suddenly spoke. I know your name, Lord Beelish. Don't belittle yourself. The handsome silver-haired young man spoke calmly. This was the first time he spoke after meeting Robert's envoys. His voice echoed in the empty hall. Oh, how did you know? Viserys suddenly spoke and caught Littlefinger off guard. The short man was slightly stunned. He didn't expect Viserys to know his name. He just didn't know how much the other party knew about him. You have been to Pentos and persuaded the governors of Pentos to take action against me. Am I right? Viserys' voice was still calm, but it made Petty Beelish sweat coldly on his forehead. He was a little speechless and didn't know how to start. Your Majesty, he did make a secret visit to Pentos and Bravos, but this should be a highly confidential matter. However, he never expected that Viserys would know about it. If he had known about this earlier, he would never take the position of envoy. Isn't this a suicide mission? Is there a traitor in the Royal Council? Who leaked the news? Then he thought of the damn old man Jon Arryn, who insisted on sending him on the mission, and put on a good for you expression. When he returns, he must make that stupid woman Lissa pay double for this account. Petty thought bitterly. Viserys' words made Littlefinger's forehead sweat instantly flow down. In his mind, he quickly screened every suspicious candidate, and at the same time, he thought about the words to deal with it. It was definitely useless to quibble. Since Viserys brought it up, he must have absolute evidence. And Hendry and Barristan, who were standing behind the chief envoy Beelish, looked at each other, and Barristan saw the tension in the young man's eyes. Then the captain of the Kingsguard, whose hair was a little grey, took a deep breath and lowered his head. In fact, he was a little nervous in his heart, afraid of being recognized by Viserys. His Royal Highness has changed a lot from that year. At that time, he was just a 6 or 7-year-old child with a naughty personality. Now he has tens of thousands of soldiers and 3 dragons. Every word and action he says on the throne exerts great psychological pressure on people. Just a few words made Petty Beelish's forehead sweat. The atmosphere in the hall was a little tense, and the usurper's messenger was a little speechless. The female knight standing behind Viserys raised her lips slightly. Her eyes passed Petty and the unknown noble of the 7 kingdoms, and fell on the old knight wearing bright armor and white robes. The usurper's Kingsguard? Maya's hand holding the hilt tightened slightly. However, at this moment, Viserys rescued Beelish, who was sweating profusely. Don't be nervous, Lord Beelish, Viserys said, staring at the other party with a pair of lavender eyes, as if he had seen through the other party. In fact, what Petty didn't know was that Viserys knew him far better than he knew himself. This was a man with a talent for money and trade, and a master of conspiracy and intrigue who was unmatched in the 7 kingdoms. He was good at playing power games. I have no intention of holding you responsible. On the contrary, I want to thank you. If you hadn't instigated those fools to attack me, I'm afraid I wouldn't have had the opportunity to take Pentos so easily. And this time, the bitter smile on Petty's face was real, and he bowed slightly again. Thank you for your tolerance, Your Majesty. Littlefinger's elegant and calm attitude just disappeared. Then he could only bite the bullet and continue the previous topic, introducing the 2 people behind him. Your Majesty, this is Hendry Bracken, the nephew of Lord Jandis Bracken, the Earl of Stonehenge. The brown-haired young man standing next to Petty looked a little nervous. It seemed that Viserys' words just now scared him. Your Majesty, Henry hurriedly imitated Littlefinger's bow just now and bowed deeply, almost kneeling on the ground and kowtowed. "This is the captain of the King's Good of His Majesty Robert, Sir Barristan Selmy, Your Majesty." The white-haired knight who was called could not continue to lower his head and pretend to be stupid. He could only take a deep breath, then look at Viserys with a sharp gaze and speak. He only hoped that Viserys had forgotten him. However, to his disappointment, Viserys still remembered him. "Well, Sir Barristan, it's been a long time." Viserys just nodded and greeted the captain of the King's Good, but did not say much, which made him a little worried. Then Littlefinger sorted out his emotions and officially began to talk about the purpose of the delegation. Robert finally couldn't stand the pressure. The defeat of the two wars made him realize that the White Walkers could not be defeated by human power, so he thought of the Red Witch who disappeared after the Battle of Winterfell. She once said that the Night King was ice and the dragon was fire, and the only thing that could defeat the Night King was the raging dragon flame. The simultaneous resurrection of the Night King and the dragon symbolizes that this is a song of ice and fire. If you want to defeat the Night King, you can only ask Viserys for help. Robert fled all the way from Winterfell to the twins, and then couldn't sleep at night. Finally, after discussions with his staff and careful consideration for a long time, he still bit the bullet and sent a raven to King's Landing, letting his old godfather Jon Arryn arrange this matter, and he himself was too embarrassed to write a handwritten letter for help. But of course, Robert didn't have any good intentions under the banner of asking Viserys for help. This time the delegation left King's Landing almost with drums and gongs, fearing that someone didn't know that the Iron Throne asked the Targaryen family for help, hoping that the other party would lend a hand. This is a well-known conspiracy, but the people of King's Landing naturally don't think about any conspiracy. They just cheered and jumped, as if they saw hope. But of course, this matter was definitely not arranged by Robert. Although Robert was soft, he still had to face it. Jon Arryn is old and has lived a clear life. He knows that face is useless and only the last laugh can win. White Walkers, dragons, wildlings, etc. These legendary things that can easily tear us apart appear one after another. Let them kill each other. Only in this way can the world become a better place. Chapter 369 Conditions. Petty Baelish tried his best to persuade Viserys to send troops to support Westeros, explaining the horror of the White Walkers. If they were not restrained, they would destroy the whole world sooner or later. Viserys was very calm from beginning to end, because he naturally knew the horror of the White Walkers, and he even knew it better than the other party. Petty's coaxing and intimidation naturally could not scare Viserys, and the White Walkers would not threaten Essos in the short term. He only cared about Robert asking for help from him. What kind of chips could he offer? He almost imagined that Robert, the fat man with a circle of black beard, gave orders with a constipated expression and asked for help from him. Then an unsullied soldier walked in from the outside, lying on Viserys, and whispering a few words. Viserys nodded slightly, then looked at the three people below, and then spoke. "It's not me who sits on the Iron Throne now, Lord Baelish. Why should I sacrifice the lives of my soldiers to save the lives of my enemies?" Littlefinger was about to speak when he heard Viserys' words and continued to talk about the threat of the White Walkers. "Your Majesty, White Walkers." However, he was directly blocked by Viserys. "Tell Robert." Viserys stood up and looked at Littlefinger standing below and said calmly, "Take off the crown and kneel down to surrender. I may allow him to continue to be the Duke of Storm's End." "Your Majesty." Petty Baelish heard Viserys' words and smiled helplessly again. This was obviously an impossible condition. Petty did come with a certain negotiating power, but this condition was obviously beyond the scope. Although there was a helpless smile on the surface, unlike the expression on his face, Littlefinger was slightly relieved in his heart. The torture was finally over. Petty Baelish always thought that he was very good at communicating with people. His mouth is his most formidable weapon. As long as his mouth is not sewn shut and he is allowed to continue to speak, he can often achieve his desired goal. However, when his proud ability to debate faced Viserys, Petty felt that his underwear was seen through. The other party seemed to know him well. After the audience, he did not realize that his back was already wet with cold sweat. "I'm serious. You can tell Robert to think about it." However, Viserys had already stood up from the throne at this time. Negotiations would definitely not produce results in 1 or 2 days, not to mention that Viserys did not intend to send troops now. He was not ready, and now he is in an active and advantageous position. He can delay as long as he wants. The 7 kingdoms are not desperate enough now, and the conditions he just said are also true. He is not joking. As long as Robert takes off the crown and kneels down to beg for surrender, Viserys can forgive his sins and let him be the Duke of Storm's End again. If they could avoid a war that would cause great suffering to all and transfer power peacefully to unify the 7 kingdoms, Viserys would not mind killing one less person. But of course, the condition that Viserys had seriously proposed was also limited in time. No one could go unpunished after making a mistake, otherwise there would be rebellions every day. If Viserys officially sent troops to land in Westeros, then this condition would naturally be invalidated. It is certainly impossible for Robert to suddenly want to surrender in exchange for the title of Duke of Storm's End when the war was halfway through. That would definitely be impossible. At that time, there would be no chance to surrender and save his life. Forgive me for my impoliteness. You have come from afar and are tired. You can rest in the palace temporarily. Of course, if you want to leave now, I will not stop you. Viserys had just received news from his personal guards, saying that the 5,000 sets of dragon scale armor that were commissioned to Master Tob and the blacksmith workshop a long time ago had been completed. This was when the 5,000 Unsullied had just arrived in Pentos, and Viserys asked the blacksmith workshop to tailor a new set of equipment for the Unsullied. The equipment of the Unsullied was too simple, the armor was not strong enough, and the swords and spears were not sharp enough, so they all had to be replaced. Of course, the equipment tailored for the Unsullied was also the best design obtained after the Unsullied personally tested it. It would not only meet their requirements for lightness, but also be easy to form a formation. Then Viserys turned to his King's Guard, and his voice seamlessly switched from the common language of Westeros to High Valyrian, and then he gave orders. This is an encrypted call. The 3 people below looked at each other and didn't know what Viserys was talking about. The female knight was of Atlantis and could only understand Valyrian. She was still in the learning stage of the common language. After hearing Viserys' order, she nodded slightly to show that she understood. Then Viserys got up and left the hall through the back door, and Maya did not follow him, but walked down the high steps with one hand on the hilt of the sword. Please follow me. She raised her hand and made a please gesture, speaking in the poor common language of Westeros. Little Fina looked at Viserys' back as he left, took a deep breath, and his eyes flickered slightly. It was unknown what he was thinking. But then he came back to his senses and looked at the female knight who had spoken and still nodded and smiled politely. It seemed that he was not affected too much by the bad negotiations just now. Viserys walked too fast and directly sent the guests away with tea, which made Hendry Bracken, who had not yet come to recognize his relatives, a little depressed, but he did not dare to say anything. On the other side, the captain of the King's Guard, Sir Barristan Selmy, who had been silent all the time, looked at the female knight in front of him who was also wearing a white robe. He wanted to say something several times, but he still held back, because he found that the other party seemed to be an authentic foreigner who didn't know much about the common language. Then the 3 followed Maya and turned around and came to the guest room area. The 9-tower palace was very large, and naturally there was a place specially arranged for guests to stay overnight. It's here. Maya still spoke in poor common language. She can only speak a few words now, mostly the most basic words like here, there please, thank you, etc. Fortunately, there are maids who understand the common language to arrange their follow-up, bathing and dinner. These guests can stroll around the city of Pentos during the day, but they can only move around in this small area of the palace, and cannot enter the depths of the palace. Maya led the 3 guests here, and was about to turn around and leave. However, at this time, Barristan finally couldn't help but call out to the other party. Madam, can I ask you a question? He didn't know the other party's name, and didn't know whether he should call her miss. If I'm not mistaken, you should be His Majesty's King's Guard? Chapter 370 Busy. After Viserys left the hall, a guard soon chased him. Your Majesty. The guard chased him and told him that the usurper's messenger Petty Beelish wanted to see the king alone. Oh. He wants to see me alone. The silver-haired young man was not surprised by this. If a man like Littlefinger didn't engage in some conspiracy, he would not be him. The stage where he was best at performing himself was never openly on the stage, but hiding in the dark and constantly provoking people's conflicts through conspiracy. Okay. Viserys nodded without hesitation. Tell Littlefinger that I don't have much free time. You'd better think about what you want to say now. He didn't like to play tricks with the other party, which was a waste of his time and energy. His words were a warning to Littlefinger to think clearly before seeing him. Understood. The guard nodded and retreated. Hula. Then Viserys pulled the reins with one hand and grabbed the saddle ring with the other hand to turn over and ride on his mount. Several guards protecting him also got on their horses, accompanied by black bugs, and then the group left the palace and rushed to the blacksmith workshop. Master Craftsman Todmot was appointed as the Minister of Craftsmen by Viserys. Although he has not yet attended the Imperial meeting, it is only a matter of time. There will be a Minister of Agriculture in the future. Viserys attaches great importance to the development of productivity. In such an era without assembly line mechanized production, craftsmen are the most basic industrial productivity. Blacksmiths can forge weapons and armor, folk iron pots and kitchen knives, hoes for hoeing the ground, etc. Carpenters can build houses and build large siege weapons, etc. Therefore, Viserys attaches the most importance to agriculture in the country. This is very similar to the nobles of Westeros, and it is more in line with Viserys' own personality. Farming is the main thing. If you want to build Andalus and Pentis into an agricultural civilization, there must be no problem with food. The second thing to pay attention to is craftsmen, because craftsmen are creativity, which can support the economic and military foundation of a huge country. The third is the traditional free trade of the trading city-state and the prosperous development of commerce. Viserys believes that the prosperity of commerce must be based on strength. Without strength, everything is empty talk, and gold ingots cannot protect it. The last is the issue of education. However, for this era, building a large number of schools to popularize education is a high investment, low return project. Viserys certainly knows the benefits of education, but it is too advanced for this era. He also wants to abolish the role of the city by distributing knowledge, but now is not the best time. This era only needs honest farmers and brave soldiers. The talents cultivated by universal education cannot be reasonably absorbed by society, but will become a burden. Because in politics, the civilization structure mainly relies on aristocratic autonomy, and the education of the aristocracy naturally does not need him to worry about it. Viserys stripped the military power of the nobles in the new dynasty, and all military power was taken over by the king. This is already a great progress. If the right to govern is stripped away, Viserys is afraid that it will be easy to withdraw eggs if he takes a big step. Some of the Westeros nobles on the other side of the narrow sea have contacted him, but most of them have a firm resistance because of the new policy. Therefore, the meal still needs to be eaten bite by bite. Viserys only provides a channel for education within the army. After all, he can fully control the military power. The promoted grassroots officers can get the opportunity to learn and come to Pentis for education. In the name of learning to become a noble, they are taught to read and write. After all, knights are the threshold of nobility. At the same time, some strategies and knowledge used on the battlefield are also taught to improve the comprehensive quality of basic officers. In addition to daily training, weapons and equipment, and generous rewards, the command ability of grassroots officers also accounts for a large proportion of the combat effectiveness of an army. Because ordinary soldiers are directly exposed to the orders of grassroots officers, not the orders of legion commanders or senior commanders. Your Majesty, this is the dragon scale armor tailored for all the unsullied soldiers. Please take a look. The gray-haired master blacksmith handed a heavy armor to Viserys. Although this armor is a bit heavy to hold, it is much lighter to wear. It also has good defensive capabilities, and has been reasonably strengthened in key parts, chest, throat, joints, etc. Injuries to these parts are likely to lead to death, while injuries to some parts will instantly lead to loss of combat effectiveness. From a Krill perspective, the lives of soldiers are worthless, just like leeks, which can be cut one crop at a time. The general should squeeze the combat effectiveness of the soldiers to the maximum extent, ensuring that they can bite a person to death with their teeth in the end. When making these armors, I also refer to the opinions of Lord Blackworm, such as the elbows. Speaking of his professional knowledge, Master Todmot chattered endlessly. People who do this job work hard, but get little benefit, and they are also easy to be blamed. His Majesty the King has finally come here once, and must seize the opportunity. At least don't make mistakes. Very good. Viserys nodded with satisfaction as he looked at this set of light and extremely strong new armor. Its helmet part still retains the design of the long spikes erected by the Unsullied. This should be the suggestion made by the Blackworm, because it is easier for the Unsullied warriors to become more familiar with it and quickly distinguish who is the commander on the chaotic battlefield. Viserys fiddled with the iron plate of the dragon scale armor in his hand. There was a Targaryen three-headed dragon emblem on the chest of the black armor, and the whole thing exuded a chill. Then he looked up at the 5,500 sets of dragon scale armor that had been packed into boxes and filled the entire warehouse. The extra ones were made to replace defective ones or those damaged in battle. Then the silver-haired young man turned his head and spoke to the Unsullied Commander Blackworm who came with him. These armors are made for the Unsullied warriors. Send someone to take them away later. Thank you, Your Majesty. Blackworm's face was solemn. He held the spear in his hand and knelt on one knee to express his gratitude to his master. In fact, Viserys did not like to petty Baelish, and he did not need to. As a king, he became very busy as soon as he returned to Pentus. When he was away, he was still a rare leisure time. Many official business that Oberyn and Rhaenys had not dealt with were piled up. After the silver-haired young man inspected the delivered armor, he immediately went to the Golden Group's base to see how the morale and training of the Golden Group soldiers were. Although Viserys has been saying that he is not in a hurry to send troops, it is only a matter of time before he sends troops. Viserys cannot sit back and watch Westeros turn into a ghost den. The Night King has really expanded beyond control, and he is the one who suffers in the end. Many commanders of the Golden Group greeted him respectfully. Many of them are descendants of those who participated in the Blackfyre Rebellion, but now they are loyal to the legitimate heir of Targaryen. After leaving the Golden Group, Viserys thought for a while, and then decided to go and see the situation of the Dragonstone fleet. The new dynasty's Minister of the Navy, Earl Joffrey, who had just resigned from the position of Prime Minister, was already old. The campaign to conquer Westeros could almost be said to be the last shining point in his life. And it was also his lifelong wish after escaping Dragonstone to restore the Targaryen dynasty, so the old man devoted himself to commanding the training of the new Dragonstone Navy. When Viserys arrived at the Dragonstone Fleet Station, he heard a piece of news that surprised him. The old man's illegitimate son who stayed in Westeros is here. Chapter 371 The Bracken Family. Henry Bracken. When Viserys first heard this name, he was a little confused. He didn't know why such an unknown little person could go to Pentus with petty Baelish, but because he was a little person, he didn't ask much. He knew the Bracken family, which was one of the oldest families in the Reach, and had the blood of the ancestors flowing in their bodies. Even according to the people of the Bracken family, in the heroic age before the invasion of the Andals, the Bracken family was the king of this land, and later suffered a backstab by the Blackwood family. The Blackwood family's statement was exactly the opposite of the Bracken family, but the history was too long and the statements of both sides could no longer be verified. The Bracken family's castle was located on the banks of the Red Fork of the Trident, called Stonehenge, while the Blackwood family of Raventree was located on the other side of the Red Fork. The two families had a blood feud for thousands of years. However, now, the two ancient families with a long history have surrendered to the Tully family. According to Viserys, the patriarch of the contemporary Bracken family is named Janus Bracken. How could this Henry be related to Joffrey? But when Viserys arrived at the headquarters of the Dragonstone fleet, he understood the whole story. It turned out that the old man's hidden background was from the Bracken family. His real name should be Joffrey Bracken, and he was the first heir to the old Earl of Bracken. He also had a sister, Jean Bracken, who was one of the wives designated by Hoster Tully, the Duke of Reveron, for his younger brother Brynden Tully, who later became the Blackfish, and he could choose but Brynden Tully didn't like any of the women designated by his brother, so the brothers turned against each other and left the family to set up their own business. Later, he escorted his niece Lyssa to marry in the Vale and was canonized as a Knight of the Bloody Gate by the Duke of the Vale. The three children of the old Duke of Bracken, the eldest is Geoffrey Bracken, the second is Jean Bracken, and the third child is the current Earl of Bracken, Janus Bracken. At that time, Geoffrey was trained as an heir by his father, the old Earl of Bracken. He was also very good looking and proficient in swordsmanship and riding. His younger brother, Janus, had nothing to do with the inheritance. He just ate, drank, and waited for death. If Geoffrey had not strongly opposed it, Janus would have been sent to the Citadel to be a bachelor. However, in such a situation, Geoffrey made a big mistake under impulse later, so he was forced to flee his hometown and fled overseas to become a mercenary. That was when he was young and energetic. He took his younger brother Janus to King's Landing, secretly drank alcohol without telling the servants, and went out to play on the street. On the street, he met Roger Blackwood, the head of the Blackwood family who had a blood feud with the Bracken family, and the father of Titus, the current head of the Blackwood family. Then the drunk Geoffrey had a conflict with Roger Blackwood for some reason. Then Geoffrey actually killed the Earl of Raventree City on the street in King's Landing. Until now, Geoffrey can't remember what happened at that time. However, killing someone in the street in King's Landing with a sword and killing the Earl of Raventree City, this incident undoubtedly caused a big mess. Afterwards, Geoffrey Bracken was wanted by Viserys' grandfather, the then King Jaehaerys Targaryen II. Geoffrey Bracken was sent to the merchant ship fleeing to Essos by his family's loyal servants and his brothers. Until this time, Geoffrey was still drunk. Then, with the days of drifting on the sea and the whistling sea breeze, he gradually accepted the fact that he had killed someone and committed a serious crime and was destined to be exiled overseas. However, his father, the old Earl Bracken, could not accept this result, and because of his poor health, he fell ill and died, and his younger brother Janus inherited the position of Earl of Stonehenge. From then on, Geoffrey kept his name incognito, no longer called his surname, and no longer returned to his hometown, until he was appreciated by Viserys' eldest brother Prince Rhaegar, joined the Dragonstone Navy and eventually grew into the commander-in-chief of the fleet. His son Henry Bracken was born to a prostitute, while he was a sellsword in Tyrosh, Lies and other places. He was then sent back to the Bracken family and given to his younger brother Janus Bracken to raise. Because he was the only heir, he got the family name. The old man never took the initiative to reveal that he had a son. It was only once that Viserys heard it, but he didn't say it again after asking. And now his illegitimate son actually took the initiative to find him. Your Majesty, Henry is much older than Viserys, even older than Littlefinger. But because he had no parents, since he was a child, and lived under someone else's roof, he seemed to have some character defects and behaved timidly. This is much different from his father, Geoffrey Bracken. The old man's hair was grey, but his back was still straight when he sat on the chair. Henry saw Viserys coming suddenly, and he stood up, and was a little at a loss, not knowing whether to continue standing or sit down. It was Viserys who waved his hand to signal him to sit down and talk, and then he hurriedly sat back in his chair. After so many years, he saw his own flesh and blood again, but there was no joy on the old man's face, but instead there was a cloud of worry. Of course, he did not blame Henry. After all, it was an extremely irresponsible behavior to abandon him in his hometown for so many years. What Geoffrey was worried about was what Viserys was thinking now. This was obviously a plot to alienate him. However, Geoffrey saw through this plot, and Viserys' brain turned a little faster than the old man. He listened to the whole story and then understood that this was a small trap designed by Robert or John Arryn, purely to add to his bets and plant the seeds of not being fully trusted. As for why they did not use the threat of hostages, let alone the negotiations for cooperation that were now underway, even if the two sides were on the verge of a fight, perhaps they knew that this trick would not work. If the old man had taken the initiative to hand over Queen Rhaella and her son who had fled to Dragonstone, it would have been easy for him to find a castle and exchange them for an earl, not to mention being absolved of his past guilt. But he didn't think about it back then, and he wouldn't think about it now. What's more, he hasn't seen his son for more than 20 years, and he is not a good father. He regards honor and responsibility more deeply than family affection. If you're listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means they downloaded and uploaded it without effort. We cordially invite you to visit our channel, Mundo Fanfic Novelos. There you'll find the original version of this story and you can explore many other novels of various genres. We're waiting for you to immerse yourself in a world of incredible novels. Chapter 372, Martial Arts Competition. It was a good thing that the old man had found his heir. Unlike what he worried about, Viserys never had any grudges about it. Strictly speaking, the Bracken family of Stonehenge had little to do with Joffrey. Not to mention that after hearing the whole story, Viserys was suspicious of the old man's brother, Janos Bracken, who was also present when the incident happened, and now the Earl of Stonehenge. Even if Janos did not do anything about this matter, he has now had 5 children and a bastard. After being the Earl for so long, Stonehenge must have nothing to do with Joffrey and Hendry. These were all heard from Hendry. He is now a marginal figure in Stonehenge, and the affairs of the Bracken family have nothing to do with him. If it weren't for Jonarin, the Duke of the Eyrie, who greeted him and brought him to King's Landing, I'm afraid that he has been appointed by his uncle as the representative of the Bracken family, and he is leading his soldiers to follow the army led by Edgemure Tully of the Tully family to the north to the Neck, to support the coalition forces. Because his uncle had 5 daughters, Janos had long disliked his nephew. Bastards want to legalize their surnames only when there is no legitimate heir, of course. Other reasons are not ruled out. This was the case with Joffrey. He only had this one bastard, and Janos Bracken had 5 daughters. Only the only bastard was a boy. The nephew with the Bracken surname also had the right of inheritance, so he was eager to send him out to die. That night, Viserys set a sumptuous banquet for the old knight in the Nine Towers Palace. The military and political leaders of Pentos all attended the banquet, mainly because they all knew the status of the old man and Viserys' heart, so they all gave him face. The envoys of the Iron Throne who returned the heir were also able to attend the banquet, and met Oberyn, who was now acting prime minister, and Irion, who was almost the future queen. There was nothing awkward about the two groups meeting each other. Littlefinger was good at socializing, and even took the initiative to talk to the Prince and Princess of Dawn. Moreover, Oberyn and Irion were in Pentos. Everyone in the 7 Kingdoms knew about it, but in the current situation of fighting against the White Walkers, no one wanted to mention it. At the Pentos dinner, an interesting episode also happened. Ser Barristan the Fearless, the captain of Robert's Kingsguard, seemed to be a little upset about the first female Kingsguard in history. After all, he has been a Kingsguard for his whole life, and has adhered to the creed of the White Knight. He believes that women becoming Kingsguards have ruined the reputation of the Kingsguard, and caused chaos in the palace, etc. However, the old knight did not bring up these things in public. His character is sometimes stubborn, but he is not a fool. Instead, when he got a chance to toast Viserys alone at the banquet, he couldn't help but persuade him on the empty balcony. He believes that there are many outstanding men in the 7 Kingdoms who can become qualified Kingsguards, and it is not necessary to choose a foreign woman. So far, Viserys' Kingsguard has only 2, and some people jokingly call it a cripple and a woman, and the reality is indeed so. The Kingsguard was founded by Queen Visenya, the wife of Aegon the Conqueror. It has been serving the royal family and loyal to the Targaryen family since its inception. Queen Visenya formulated the creed and principles of the Kingsguard, based on the oath of the Night's Watch, and emphasized that loyalty is more important than martial arts. Viserys, holding a wine glass in his hand, and supporting his elbow on the balcony, spoke without turning his head in the slightly cold evening breeze. Then he turned his head, and glanced at Barristan Selmy. His White Knight was also standing behind him. Even though he heard Barristan's doubts, he did not get angry, but just held the hilt of his sword without saying a word. As the first female Kingsguard in history, she has to endure more than just these criticisms. Since the birth of the Kingsguard, only 2 legitimate White Knights have served a king who was not a Targaryen. One is Kingslayer Jaime Lannister, and the other is you, Lord Fearless Barristan Selmy. As soon as Viserys said this, the old knight's face flushed red. It was a great shame to put him and the Kingslayer together. However, what was even more shameful was that, if you think about it carefully, what Viserys said was indeed true. The last Targaryen king who sat on the Iron Throne was Viserys' father, Aerys II. And his kings good, Sir Gerald Hightower, White Bull, Prince Lewin Martell, Jon Oswell Rivers, and Sword of the Morning Arthur Dayne were all killed in the battle. The only two who survived and surrendered to the enemy were the Kingslayer and Barristan Selmy. Then Viserys looked at his kings good. I allow you to challenge Lord Selmy and prove your martial arts. The female knight, who had been holding back her anger after hearing Viserys' words, stood up without saying a word and challenged the old knight. The incident on the windowsill outside the banquet hall did not attract the attention of those inside, and Barristan was a little embarrassed to be challenged by a woman. Then the lively banquet hall was filled with toasts and a sharp sound of metal collision was heard. Ding, ha. What happened? Everyone in the banquet hall stood up suddenly and looked towards the place where the sound came from. However, they found that a small episode had happened here at some point. The captain of the usurpers Kingsguard stood there in a daze with a broken sword in his hand, and the female knight's Valyrian steel sword was already on his neck. Maya used her own Valyrian steel sword, which was indeed an unfair victory. But the fact that Viserys could give a precious dragon steel sword to his subordinates was enough to explain the problem. Barristan Selmy looked a little gloomy, perhaps he was in self-doubt because of Viserys' words. In the end, he did not agree to continue the sword duel, but left in a daze on the pretext of feeling unwell. The little episode at the banquet did not cause much waves. After all, they did not know the specific cause and effect of what happened, just thought that two Kingsguards from two camps competed with each other, and the female knight next to his majesty won, defeating the old knight with white hair. Then, the banquet ended. Barristan left the venue early due to physical discomfort, and there were no other spies of the Iron Throne around Littlefinger. Not long after, Littlefinger appeared outside Viserys' study under the guidance of the guards. Your Majesty, I have been instructed by Queen Cersei to mediate the conflict between the Targaryen and Lannister families. Chapter 373 Cersei's sincerity. Women's sixth sense is indeed very sharp. Cersei has a strong sense of crisis. When her husband and brother thought that everything was still under control, she became deeply anxious. Pentos is located directly opposite King's Landing. The two giant cities are separated by only a narrow sea. If we only count the straight line distance and ignore the travel time, Pentos is even closer to King's Landing than the Neck. The remnant of the Targaryen now has more than 60,000 soldiers in Pentos, as well as war weapons such as elephants and 3 dragons, eyeing Westeros covetously. They can easily turn King's Landing and hundreds of thousands of people here into ashes. It all depends on whether Viserys wants to become an Ashes King and lead his burning legion to destroy the 7 kingdoms. And now for the 7 kingdoms, which are plagued by internal and external troubles. Perhaps the only thing that can prevent Viserys from leading his troops across the narrow sea is his own supply problem. There are too many troops, so the supply must keep up with the configuration, and the food and grass must go before the troops move. Since Viserys returned, the preparations he has carried out have mainly focused on logistics and supplies. Otherwise, if there is a problem with the supply of the cross-sea expedition, it may be a disastrous consequence. The conflict between Targaryen and Lannister, in fact, strictly speaking, has nothing to do with Cersei herself. It was done by his father, Duke Tywin, and his brother, the Kingslayer. Cersei has been a serious face control patient since she was a child. When she was a girl, she was attracted by Prince Rhaegar's appearance and temperament, and even had a great chance to marry him. Unfortunately, the marriage proposal made by Duke Tywin for his daughter Cersei was rejected by King Aerys II. Even in Viserys' memory, Cersei still seemed to be obsessed with her brother Rhaegar many years later. After she became the regent queen mother and actually took power, she appointed Oren Waters, the illegitimate son of Tidehead Island, as the admiral of the navy, just because the other party looked a bit like Rhaegar, which reminded her of the perfect prince who existed in her girlhood dream. Mediate the conflict between Targaryen and Lannister? Viserys sat behind the desk with his fingers crossed. The lights in the study were bright, and his violet eyes reflected the light slightly. This sentence was beyond his expectation. His eyes fell on Littlefinger, and he looked him up and down slightly, then sneered and said, Lord Baelish, you should know that this is impossible. In front of his majesty, how can I be considered a lord? Littlefinger still had a respectful smile on his face and spoke humbly. For the class differentiation in Westeros, Lord is a common title for nobles. From the Duke to a property knight, they can all be called Lord. Although Littlefinger's family fiefdom is small, they are also nobles. Although the king is the largest noble in the country, he is not suitable for Lord, but has a higher level of title. Nobles must respect the king, but this does not mean that the king can look down on the nobles who swear allegiance to him at will. It was strictly reasonable for Viserys to call Petty Baelish the Littlefinger noble lord of the Five Fingers Peninsula, which showed his excellent orthodox royal upbringing and courtesy, but it was undoubtedly ironic in this situation. However, the silver-haired young man ignored Petty Baelish's words and continued to speak in a cold voice. The Lannister betrayed his king. Loren Lannister, the last Lannister king of Casterly Rock, was defeated in the War of Rage against Aegon. Loren knelt in front of Aegon and begged for surrender, willing to give up the title of king and offer eternal loyalty to the Targaryen family for generations to come. Lord Baelish, can you translate what eternal loyalty means? Petty Baelish was somewhat speechless by Viserys' words. The Baratheon family was a usurper who betrayed their king, and these families who had helped the usurper rebel also broke their oaths. Eternity. It means forever. Littlefinger took a deep breath, his voice a little hoarse. Eternity? Yes, eternity means forever. But the Lannister family betrayed the eternal oath of his ancestors. What's more, the Lannister family has committed unforgivable crimes. My nephew Aegon and my sister-in-law Princess Elia Martell reign over countless people who were massacred and bloodbathed by the Lannister family. The candlelight flickered in the gorgeous study, and the shadow of the silver-haired young man was cast on the wall. He did not stand up, but the 5 fingers on the table gradually clenched into a fist. It seemed that his emotions were affected and fluctuated slightly. But whether it was mostly performance or true feelings, only Viserys himself knew it best. I like a widely circulated informal motto of Lannister: a Lannister must pay his debts. I'm curious about what price Lannister wants to pay for this blood debt. Viserys took a deep breath to calm his emotions, and then asked word by word. But in fact, many years ago, except for the earliest followers, Viserys swore to his mother, Queen Rhaella, when Viserys and his son were still on Dragonstone. One day, he would lead his troops back to Westeros and make the Lannisters pay with blood. Kevin Lannister, who died in his hands, was just the beginning. Petty Baelish was calm in the face of Viserys, but in fact, his eyes were like knives, and cold sweat appeared on his forehead again. Aura is often related to a person's status. Even if a beggar has a strong aura, it is difficult to intimidate a noble. Sitting on the throne, Viserys really holds the power of life and death of Petty Baelish. At this time, every word of his is a great pressure for Littlefinger. Her Majesty is willing to pay great sincerity to mediate the conflict between the two families. Then Petty Baelish spoke with a bit of a stiff upper lip. He already regretted taking Cersei's job, but there was no way. This was also an extremely important step for him to plan for his future. If the bet is right, he will rise to prominence and become the real Lord of Baelish. Sincerity? Viserys' expression remained calm, and he picked up a book to read tonight. He told Littlefinger to save time and think clearly about what he was going to say. Now that it has been so long, he is impatient. He doesn't think Cersei would want to show any sincerity. She is a smart little woman. But then he heard Petty Baelish speak in a somewhat dry voice. The queen's sincerity is herself. What did you say? Viserys, who was about to close the door and see the guest off, was slightly stunned when he heard this. Then he looked up at Littlefinger, who had said something shocking, and then he heard him continue to speak. And the head of Jon Arryn, Duke of the Vale, the usurper's former hand. Chapter 374, Corpse Demon Rowing. Viserys was indeed shocked by the shocking words of Littlefinger, who came from afar. In the rear headquarters of the coalition army and the twins, Robert Baratheon, the king of the 7 kingdoms, was lying naked on the bed with a free daughter in his arms and sleeping soundly. He didn't know that there was already green grassland above his head, and he was a green-haired turtle. Even before he died, his wife threw herself into the arms of his biggest enemy and intended to find another father with her child. But perhaps he should be comforted that Viserys did not have the habit of driving a big car and was not very interested in other people's wives. He always thought that he was just a teenager. although it sounded a bit tempting that the Queen of the Seven Kingdoms took the initiative to climb onto the bed. Thinking about what Cersei did, perhaps this idea was instantly dispelled. Although Cersei's behavior was indeed excessive, Robert was never a fuel-saving lamp. He kept saying that the only woman he loved in his life was the daughter of the Stark family, Lyanna Stark, who had the blood of the running wolf. However, he left behind an illegitimate daughter in the Vale, and after the engagement, he never stopped visiting prostitutes, even once. Even Lyanna herself told her brother Eddard she can be sure that Robert loves her, but she can't stop Robert from falling in love with other women in the future. And Robert and Cersei did not restrain themselves after they became kings after marriage and went out to visit prostitutes every now and then. Therefore, neither Robert nor Cersei is a rule-abiding person. It's just a matter of having a few boats under their feet, and everyone is the same. It's no wonder that Cersei has to take her 2 children to prepare early and find a way out. This woman regards her children more seriously than anyone else. And the situation in King's Landing may have already smelled the smell of danger regarding Jon Arryn's investigation not long ago. Because winter is coming, Jon Arryn did not dare to attack her because the old Prime Minister still has reason. Cersei missed this opportunity. In order to protect herself, she had no overall view and would not consider the coalition forces or the White Walkers. She would only take the initiative to eliminate the other party. As for why she wanted to throw herself into the arms of Viserys, it was because the Light of the West had sufficient confidence in her appearance. She had golden hair and beautiful eyes. Although she had given birth to 2 children, the years had not left any traces on her. Some people compared her with Lyanna Stark, who was obsessed with Prince Rhaegar and believed that Lyanna was indeed beautiful, but the torchlight could not compare with the rising sun. However, in addition to her appearance, the more important thing was that she could not lose her status as queen. She already enjoyed the feeling of being under one person and above everyone else. If she lost power and the attention of the public, she would go crazy. Robert was sleeping soundly with the girl in his arms, and he had no idea about the secret talk. Now the situation of the coalition forces was naturally to go all out to deal with the upcoming third war between humans and ghosts. The human coalition forces against the army of the dead. In fact, the army of the dead did not stop during this period and did not attack the Bay of Kalin. It's that the land of the north is too vast. The land of the north may be the sum of the other 6 countries. The army of the dead has captured half of Westeros. It's just that due to the cold climate and harsh environment in the north, the population of the north is not large. It belongs to the situation of vast land and sparse population. Therefore, the main economic lifeline, population and military strength of the 7 countries are mainly concentrated in the south of the neck. Humanity has experienced 2 disastrous defeats, but is far from being completely defeated. The nobles of the 7 countries can still accumulate powerful forces to continue to fight against the dead. As Viserys said, the 7 countries are far from desperate now. People will also burst out with tenacious willpower in critical moments. Viserys hopes to become a savior-like role in Westeros, and he is now waiting for such an opportunity. Because the war has been under their noses, the nobles of the 7 countries naturally can't slack off. They are preparing for the war with all their strength. A large number of strategic resources such as catapults, crossbows, kerosene, etc. have been continuously transported to the front line of Kalin Bay. During this period, the army of the dead has been spreading across the vast land of the north, sweeping through all the castles, towns, and villages like a plague. They marched aimlessly in the wind and snow, and then pulled out those who were hoping for a lucky break. Although most people in the north have evacuated, even the bandits and wildlings who could escape have all fled. But there are still some people who don't believe in evil, are unwilling to leave their homes, and have a lucky mentality. In the end, they all became part of the army of the dead ghosts and became zombies. Although their number is small, it is still a huge number that cannot be ignored when magnified to the entire vast north. All castles, towns, and villages were broken and slaughtered by the army of the dead. The entire north has truly become a hell on earth. All vitality is disappearing rapidly, and it has become completely dead silent. The light of life has been wiped out from this land. The appearance of the White Walkers in Westeros was a big news of earthquake level for the whole Western world. Even the crazy fighting between the Dothraki people on the Great Grass Sea seemed insignificant. As for the White Walkers, not only Viserys was concerned, but other free trade cities were also very concerned about this monster that came out of the land of eternal winter. An expedition team from Bravos set out from the cloth dealer's wharf, landed at Widow's Watch, and then headed towards Langenberg and Horwood along the seashore. Fortunately, they did not encounter any attacks from the army of the dead throughout the journey, but unfortunately, they did not see any life along the way. Not only humans, but even birds and beasts disappeared in the white wind and snow, and everything with it. This is a desperate situation seen by the Bravos expedition team, and it is also the foreseeable tomorrow if Westeros falls. The brave expedition team continued to move towards the depths of the dangerous north, but in the distant bright flame bay of the Sunset Sea, the white wind and snow covered the bay, greatly affecting the vision. If someone saw the scene happening in front of them, they would definitely scream out in surprise. Because a large group of unconscious whites, some of whom were left with only skeletons, some with unknown liquids flowing from the corners of their mouths, and some with half of their bodies, seemed to be quietly pushing wooden boats into the sea under some kind of imperceptible guidance. Crash, the waves of the sea were rolling, and the wooden boats collided with each other. Then a white ghost wearing ice armor and a skull head, with a long white beard on his chin, his eyes burning with ice blue flames, strode into the cold sea water, and then boarded the wooden boat that was pushed into the sea. Following him was a white ghost who was obviously a woman, also wearing ice armor, and there seemed to be a metal badge on her chest, but it was not clear. She had a transparent ice bow and arrow on her back, long brown hair, and a pair of dead eyes without any human color. Then she let out a sharp scream, like a crack in the ice. Countless corpse ghosts on the coast began to march silently, pouring into the sea, and climbing onto the wooden boats that were pushed into the sea. Chapter 375 Kuroshio Island. This is an island in the sea, with a shallow beach winding, and clean seawater constantly washing the reefs on the edge of the coast. Today is a good day, the sun is bright and cloudless. Above the reef is a towering cliff, where a fishing village is located, with smoke rising from the kitchen. Below the cliff, on the beach not far away, a group of barefoot iron people were wearing wet shorts, and rolled up their trouser legs under the sun, dragging ropes in their hands, shouting slogans, and then dragging their fishing boats ashore. A boy with brown hair and black eyes, whose skin looked a little dark due to years of exposure to the sun, was among them. He patted his palms, that were a little red from towing the boat, and then spit on the ground. "Glenn, we are lucky today." At this time, a boy from the same village, who had just towed the boat with him, came up with a fish basket and greeted him. Today, a group of fellow villagers went out to sea at dawn. They went around for a whole morning, and returned home when the sun was about to reach its peak. For the residents living on the island in this era, life was not stressful. They lived by the mountains and the water. They did not want to get rich overnight. They did not have the dream of getting rich. At least they had enough food by the sea. If they could not catch fish, they could pick up some shells on the beach. Today, they had a good harvest. They caught a lot of fish. Some of them could be eaten fresh in fish soup, and the rest could be pickled into salted fish or dried fish. At least they would not have to go out to sea again for a while. Glenn was an out-and-out iron race. He was born on Kuroshio Island, the northernmost island of the Iron Islands. Kuroshio Island is very small, only 1/10 the size of Great White Island. The population on the island is not large. There are sparse villages and a simple castle. The lord here is the Blacktis family, which is also a small family with a weak presence. The emblem is black and green fur patterns. Hearing his companion's greeting, Glenn, who was distracted for some reason, also raised his head. He forced a smile and clapped his hands with his companion, then watched his companion go away, and the smile on the dark-skinned boy's face gradually disappeared. Glenn's condition was not very good today. Although they were lucky to catch a lot of fish today, Glenn didn't put in much effort, and even let a big fish go, because of his distraction. However, his companions from the same small fishing village did not blame him. Everyone has bad times, and they still shared today's harvest equally. He didn't know why he always had a feeling of worry and loss in his heart, as if some huge danger was about to come, but in fact nothing happened. The drowned god is above. Glenn prayed silently in his heart, hoping that the great drowned god who suffered for them would bless the safety of the iron race. The dark-skinned boy stood on the beach with his bag of fish, shook his head and let out a long breath, trying to clear his heart. Then he carried his fish basket and walked towards home. His elderly mother at home was still waiting for him to return. His mother was once a concubine plundered by his father from the Greenlands. She was the only one who gave birth to a son for his father. In Glenn's memory, his mother hated his father very much. However, with the death of his father, his mother gradually stopped mentioning her former homeland. Now she even urged Glenn to snatch a wife back like a true Ironborn. My own woman. The dark-skinned boy felt his body getting hot every time he thought of this, but he only had the heart, but not the courage. He did not dare to follow Lord Blacktice to the sea to follow the ancient path, let alone kill people. Not long ago, Lord Bela Blacktice seemed to take advantage of the civil unrest in the Seven Kingdoms, to lead the fleet, to harass the passing fleets in the west. When the Iron Islands surrendered to the Iron Throne, they dared to harass the major lords along the coast from time to time, not to mention that the nobles in the Greenlands are still busy with their own affairs. I heard they are in big trouble now. What? White Walkers or something like that? Glenn was holding the fish basket and thinking wildly in his mind, but he didn't notice that on the sea behind him, at a distance, but in the shadows, some warships seemed to gradually appear. They were densely packed all over the sea and were heading towards Kuroshio Island. A disaster came very suddenly. Glenn was cooking a pot of rich fresh fish soup in an iron pot at home while enduring his mother's chattering. However, at this time, panicked shouts suddenly came from the small fishing village, as if something extremely terrible had happened. The mother's reaction was faster and more alert than the black-skinned boy. The years had made her experience too many stories. She immediately asked Glenn to drop the pot and spoon and go out to see what happened. At the same time, she took out a scimitar left by Glenn's father and gave it to her son. Maybe pirates attacked Kuroshio Island. However, the Ironmen are the biggest pirates. Which pirates dare to attack the Iron Islands? But Glenn was still scared by his mother's words. Looking into his mother's eyes, he mustered up the courage to take the scimitar left by his father and then tucked it behind him and strode out. However, the situation outside was even more terrifying than the pirates. Because Glenn, who had just walked out of the house with the scimitar, saw a companion who had gone fishing with him this morning and shook hands with him before leaving. He was like a madman at this moment. His eyes were blue, saliva was flowing from his mouth, and his body was full of dazzling blood. He pounced on an old man in the village, and was lying on him, and biting him desperately. An iron man who rushed out shouted, and bravely drew his sword, to kill the crazy villager. However, at this moment, he was pierced through the chest by an ice arrow that flew from nowhere, and his body was shot out and nailed to the earth wall behind him. A woman with long brown hair and eyes burning with ice blue flames was holding an ice bow. Her face was as cold as the flames in her eyes. She shot an Ironman with an arrow, and then her eyes fell on Glenn. The dark-skinned boy looked at the woman and shuddered instantly. He had no intention of rushing up to avenge his companions, but turned around and ran away. Mother. Glenn fled back to the room, pulled his mother up, and fled towards the outside of the village. However, at this moment, the whole fishing village was full of the sounds of ghosts and wolves howling. Not long after that, the screams that resounded over the fishing village gradually quieted down, and then became silent. End of this chapter. Thank you very much for reaching the end. Don't forget to like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription, or donation encourages us to continue. Thanks to everyone. See you in the next video.